Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Ellis Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in June 2023. I never should have taken that shortcut through Mammoth Cave National Park. The ranger at the visitor center had warned me against venturing off the marked trails, especially as dusk approached. But after 3 days of solo hiking through Kentucky's backcountry, I was eager to reach my campsite before nightfall. "Just follow the river south for another 4 miles, she'd said, tracing her finger along the map. "Beautiful views, but it'll add about 2 hours to your hike." 2 hours I didn't want to spend with my aching feet and dwindling water supply. The hollow, a narrow passage between limestone ridges, would cut that time in half. It wasn't on any official park maps, but a local at the general store had mentioned it to me. "Folks don't go there much," he'd muttered, eyes down as he rang up my trail mix and jerky. Bad history in that hollow. I should have heeded his warning. But I was a data analyst from Chicago, used to navigating complex problems. A simple woodland shortcut didn't intimidate me. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? Get lost for an hour? My GPS would guide me back to the main trail. Looking back, I realize how arrogant I was. The hollow started innocently enough, a barely discernible deer path cutting between ancient trees. Ferns brushed against my pants as I made my way deeper into the passage. The limestone walls grew taller on either side, gradually closing in until only a narrow strip of sky remained visible overhead. The air felt heavier here, stagnant, as if reluctant to circulate through this forgotten place. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The GPS app showed my location as a blue dot in the middle of green nothingness, but at least it was still tracking. I'd loaded offline maps before starting the trip. An hour into the hollow, the path began to wind more than I expected. The contour lines on my map suggested a fairly straight route, but the reality was a series of switchbacks that zigzagged between the increasingly narrow walls. Strange rock formations jutted out from the limestone, shapes that seemed almost too deliberate to be natural, yet too bizarre to be man-made. The silence struck me first. The usual forest sounds, birds, rustling leaves, distant water, had disappeared. Only my footsteps and breathing disturbed the unnatural quiet. I tried whistling, but the sound died quickly as if swallowed by the air itself. By the time I noticed the faint smell of something rotting, I was too deep into the hollow to easily turn back. It was subtle at first, just a hint of decay that I attributed to a dead animal somewhere off the trail. But with each step, the odor intensified, sweet and putrid simultaneously, like meat left too long in summer heat. I pulled my bandana over my nose, breathing through my mouth. The smell seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls of the hollow had widened slightly, revealing small cave openings that yawned like black mouths in the limestone. The dying sunlight hardly penetrated here, and my headlamp cast eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees that created them. Then I found the first item, a weathered hiking boot, partially hidden under fallen leaves. It was a men's size, larger than mine, and had clearly been there for months, perhaps years. The leather was cracked and moldering, but still recognizable. I nudged it with my trekking pole, uncertain why its presence disturbed me so deeply. I should have turned back then. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the light was fading fast and reversing course would mean spending the night in the hollow. Pressing forward seemed like the lesser evil. 20 minutes later, I came across the second abandoned item, a backpack hung on a tree branch about 7 feet off the ground. Not fallen, not discarded, but deliberately placed. Its fabric was faded but intact, showing no signs of animal interference. Who would leave a perfectly good backpack suspended from a tree in the middle of nowhere? I debated whether to check its contents, curiosity warring with unease. Curiosity won. Using my pole, I managed to hook the strap and lower the pack. It was surprisingly heavy. The zipper stuck, but with some effort I pried it open. Inside were normal hiking supplies: a water filter, a first aid kit, a camping stove, all in serviceable condition. But beneath these items lay a journal, its pages warped from moisture. The handwriting was tight and meticulous, documenting a solo hiking trip much like mine. The entries started optimistically, describing the beauty of Kentucky's wilderness, but grew increasingly disturbed. The final entry, dated 3 years earlier, simply read, "They're in the caves. They're watching. Don't sleep." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I shoved the journal into my own pack, unable to leave it behind but unwilling to examine it further in the gathering darkness. The smell of decay had grown stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. As if in response to my thoughts, a sound echoed through the hollow, a low, rumbling noise that might have been a distant rockfall or a growl from something alive. I froze, listening intently. Nothing followed. The silence returned, somehow more menacing than before. Darkness was falling rapidly now. My original plan, to pass through the hollow before nightfall, was no longer feasible. I needed shelter. The hollow's walls offered few options, but about 50 yards ahead I spotted a slight overhang that might provide some protection. Setting up camp took longer than usual. My hands trembled as I assembled my tent, fumbling with the familiar poles. The feeling of being watched intensified. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every whisper of wind made me jerk toward the sound, but my headlamp revealed nothing beyond the immediate circle of light. I didn't risk a fire. Something warned me against announcing my presence more than necessary. Instead, I ate a cold dinner of jerky and trail mix, washing it down with water that tasted faintly metallic despite my filter. The journal from the backpack sat untouched beside me, its presence a constant reminder of my predicament. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually won. I drifted off with my knife clutched in one hand, earplugs left deliberately out despite the habit of always using them in the wilderness. I needed to hear if anything approached. I woke to absolute darkness and the certainty that I wasn't alone. My headlamp had died, or been turned off, and the moonlight couldn't penetrate the dense canopy above. The air in my tent felt disturbed, as if something had been moving around me while I slept. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, so strong I could taste it. With shaking hands, I reached for my backup flashlight in the side pocket of my pack. It clicked on, the beam weaker than it should have been, but enough to reveal that I was still alone in the tent. Everything appeared untouched, except my backpack had been moved. Not dramatically, just rotated about 45 degrees from where I'd left it. And sitting atop it was a small object I didn't recognize. A crude figurine fashioned from twigs and sinew, roughly human-shaped but with elongated limbs and an oversized head. A piece of paper was wrapped around its middle, secured with what looked like human hair. I almost screamed then. Only years of training myself to remain calm in stressful situations, a necessity in my high-pressure job, kept me from completely losing my composure. Instead, I took 3 deep breaths and forced myself to examine the object more closely. The paper contained a single word, written in the same tight handwriting as the journal: "Leave." A warning? A threat? Either way, I intended to comply as soon as daylight arrived. I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. A sound outside the tent made me freeze. Footsteps, but not quite right, too irregular, as if the walker had an odd, lurching gait. They circled my tent once, twice, coming closer with each revolution. I clutched my knife tighter, knowing it would provide little protection against whatever was out there. The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent entrance. The fabric bulged slightly as if something was pressing against it. Not enough to tear, just enough to let me know it could come in if it wanted to. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. A response came, but not in words. A low, wet sound, something between a chuckle and a gurgle, emanated from just inches away, separated from me by only the thin nylon of my tent. Then came a smell so foul I had to press my sleeve against my nose to keep from gagging. It was the same rotting odor from earlier, but concentrated, as if the source was right outside. The pressure against the tent released, and the footsteps retreated. I sat motionless, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I began to hope whatever it was had left, a scratching sound began on the roof of the tent. Slow, deliberate strokes, like fingers dragging across the material. I endured this torment until the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. The scratching had stopped about an hour earlier, and no further sounds had broken the silence. Still, I waited until I could clearly see the outline of the trees before cautiously unzipping the tent. The clearing looked normal in the gray morning light. No footprints disturbed the ground where I'd heard the walking. No evidence remained of my nighttime visitor except the twig figurine, which I'd placed outside the tent sometime during the night, unable to bear its presence near me. But, as I started to pack up camp, I noticed something that turned my blood cold. My water bottle, left outside the tent vestibule overnight, was full. I distinctly remembered it being nearly empty when I went to sleep, planning to refill it at the stream marked on my map later that day. Someone, or something, had filled it for me. With trembling hands, I unscrewed the cap and sniffed. No odor. I poured a small amount onto my fingers. The liquid was clear but slightly viscous, not quite like water. I wiped it hastily on the ground, repulsed. I broke camp in record time, shoving equipment haphazardly into my pack. The journal from the abandoned backpack I kept accessible, hoping it might contain clues about what I was facing. As the hollow brightened with morning light, it seemed less threatening, but I didn't trust the change. Something was wrong about this place. Fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. According to my map, I should reach the end of the hollow within 2 hours of hiking. I set off at a brisk pace, eager to put this place behind me. The walls of the hollow continued to display those odd formations, now clearly visible as shapes that resembled distorted faces, bodies contorted in painful positions, hands reaching out from the stone. I told myself they were just natural erosion patterns, the human mind's tendency to see faces in random objects. But their placement seemed too deliberate, too consistent to be random. An hour into my morning hike, I came across a cave entrance larger than the others. It gaped from the limestone wall, easily large enough for a person to enter upright. A cool breeze emanated from it, carrying that now familiar scent of decay. I would have hurried past, but something glinted within the darkness, something that caught the morning light and reflected it back in a way that natural cave formations don't. Before I could talk myself out of it, I directed my flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a chamber about 15 feet deep, its walls glistening with moisture. And along those walls, arranged with museum-like precision, were dozens of items I recognized as hiking gear. Watches, compasses, cameras, knives. Some looked relatively new, others were vintage pieces that might have been decades old. My breath caught as I realized what I was seeing. Trophies, collected from hikers who had passed through this hollow and never left. A sound from deeper within the cave sent me scrambling backward, a shuffling noise accompanied by that same wet chuckle I'd heard outside my tent. I didn't wait to see what emerged. I ran, my pack bouncing painfully against my back, trekking poles forgotten by the cave entrance. The path began to slope upward, the walls of the hollow drawing closer together. My lungs burned, but fear drove me forward. The trees thinned, suggesting I was nearing the edge of the forested area. Hope flared. If I could just reach open ground, perhaps whatever dwelled in this place would be reluctant to follow. Then I rounded a bend and skidded to a stop, confronted by a sight that defied explanation. A man stood in the middle of the path, his back to me. He wore hiking clothes similar to mine, but they hung from his frame in tatters, exposing skin that was mottled with dark patches. His hair was matted into clumps, and even from behind I could see that his posture was wrong, shoulders hunched at an impossible angle, head cocked too far to one side. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Are you okay?" Slowly, with movements that reminded me of a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer, the figure turned. What I saw will haunt me until my dying day. It had once been human, that much was clear from the general shape, but the face was a ruin of decomposition and something else, something that suggested active reconstruction rather than simple decay. The eyes were gone, the sockets filled with a black substance that glistened wetly. The mouth stretched too wide, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. And through gaps in the tattered clothing, I could see that the skin wasn't just discolored. It was transforming, patches of it hardening into something that resembled the limestone of the hollow's walls. "Help! Me!" The words emerged as a gurgle, pushed through vocal cords that were no longer fully organic. Too late for me. Run. My paralysis broke. I veered off the path, scrambling up the steep side of the hollow. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, but terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, a wail rose, not just from the transformed hiker but from multiple sources, echoing through the hollow as if the very walls were crying out. Hands clawed at my ankles, actual hands extending from the earth itself, fingers of root and stone grasping at my boots. I kicked free, losing one boot in the process but continuing to climb. When I reached the ridgeline, I risked a glance back. The hollow spread below me, and in the morning light I could see what had been hidden in the shadows. Movement. Not just the former hiker, who was now crawling up the slope after me with that unnatural, jerky motion, but dozens of figures emerging from caves and crevices along the hollow's length. Some were clearly once human, in various stages of the same transformation I'd witnessed. Others were something else, something that had never been human at all. Running on pure adrenaline, I continued along the ridge until I found a deer trail leading away from the hollow. My sense of direction was shot, but I didn't care which way I went as long as it was away. The sun had fully risen now, casting a deceptively peaceful light over the Kentucky wilderness. After an hour of painful travel, hobbling with one boot gone, I emerged onto a paved road. A pickup truck approached and I waved frantically. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, took one look at my state and pulled over. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" he asked as I collapsed into the passenger seat. I couldn't tell him the truth. Who would believe me? "Got lost," I managed. "There was a hollow between limestone ridges." The man's expression changed, sympathy replaced by wariness. "Bell Witch Hollow?" I stared at him, the name unfamiliar but sending chills down my spine nonetheless. "Maybe? It's not on the park maps." "No, it wouldn't be." He put the truck in gear, glancing nervously toward the forest I'd emerged from. "They stopped marking it after what happened to the Dawson family in '97. Whole hiking group disappeared except for the youngest boy. He came out, changed." "Changed how?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. The old man shook his head. "Not right in the head anymore. Kept talking about the Bell Witch taking the others, turning them into part of the hollow. Said they'd been claimed by the stone. Doctors called it trauma-induced psychosis." My hand went to my pack, where the journal from the abandoned backpack sat. "And no one investigated?" "Oh, they searched. Found nothing. The hollow has its own rules, folks around here say. It shows you what it wants you to see, takes who it wants to take." He eyed me sidelong. "You're lucky to have made it out at all." I thought of the transformed hiker's words. Too late for me. And the collection of trophies in the cave. How many had the hollow claimed over the years? How many had become part of whatever lived within those limestone walls? The old man drove me to the ranger station, where I reported being lost without mentioning the specifics of what I'd encountered. I claimed I'd dropped my pack while scrambling up a slope, explaining my missing equipment. They gave me water, food, and a spare pair of boots from the lost and found. When I was finally alone in a motel room that night, I opened the journal I'd taken from the hollow. The handwriting belonged to someone named Marcus Finch, a geology graduate student who had ventured into the hollow to study its unusual limestone formations. His entries became increasingly disturbing as he documented changes in his own body, skin hardening, senses altering, thoughts becoming less his own. The final pages contained a crude map showing a network of caves running beneath the hollow, far more extensive than anything on official geological surveys. And in the center of this network, Marcus had drawn a chamber labeled simply, "Her Nest." I closed the journal, unable to read more. That night I dreamed of limestone walls closing in around me, of my skin slowly turning to stone, of joining the chorus of trapped souls whose wails echoed through Bell Witch Hollow. I left Kentucky the next day and haven't returned since. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of my Chicago apartment, I feel a strange texture on my ankle where those earthen hands had grasped me. A small patch of skin that's just slightly too hard, too cool to the touch. And in those moments, I know that some part of me never left that hollow. Some part of me belongs to it now, just as surely as the transformed hikers and the countless trophies in that cave. The Bell Witch has marked me, and one day, I fear, she'll call me back to claim what's hers. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in September 2024. The Red River Gorge had always called to me. Something about those sandstone cliffs and hemlock forests nestled in eastern Kentucky pulled at my soul whenever life in Cincinnati became too much. I'd been backpacking there since college, but after my divorce last year, those solo trips had become more frequent, almost desperate attempts to outrun the emptiness following me. This trip was supposed to be different. My older brother James had finally agreed to join me after years of refusing. Camping is just intentional homelessness, he used to joke. But after his own marital problems started, he reluctantly agreed that maybe getting away might help clear his head. We planned a 3-day hike through the Clifty Wilderness area, one of the more remote sections of the gorge. It was late September, and the first hints of autumn were touching the forest. The weather report promised cool, clear conditions, perfect for hiking and sleeping under the stars. "You sure this trail isn't too ambitious?" James asked as I parked my Subaru at the Bison Way trailhead near Nada Tunnel. He was scrolling through the trail map on his phone, frowning at the elevation changes. "We'll be fine," I assured him, shouldering my pack. "You still go to the gym, right? Besides, the views at Whistling Arch are worth it." James grunted, putting away his phone and adjusting his borrowed backpack. "Battery's almost dead anyway. What's the point of coming out here if I'm just staring at a screen?" I smiled, already feeling the weight of civilization slipping away. "That's the spirit." The first few miles were pleasant enough. The trail followed Chimney Top Creek before cutting up through a series of switchbacks. James kept pace better than I expected, though he complained about the new hiking boots I'd convinced him to buy. "They're like wearing cement blocks," he grumbled, but pushed on. We reached our first campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing near Half Moon Rock. The overlook provided a stunning panorama of the gorge, the distant cliffs glowing amber in the late sunlight. "Okay, I get it now," James admitted as we set up camp. "It's pretty spectacular." I busied myself building a fire while James filtered water from a nearby spring. The temperature was already dropping, and a crisp breeze whispered through the pines. As darkness fell, we sat before the crackling flames, passing a flask of bourbon between us. "So, how bad is it with Melissa?" I finally asked. James stared into the fire. "She wants to separate. Says I'm not the man she married." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Maybe she's right." He took another swig. What about you? Dating again yet? I shook my head. Not ready. The conversation dwindled as the night deepened. The forest came alive with sounds, the hooting of owls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the creaking of tree limbs in the wind. But there was something else too. Something I couldn't quite place. Do you hear that? I asked. James cocked his head. Hear what? Like whistling, but not quite. We both listened. For a moment there was nothing but the normal forest sounds. Then, faintly, I heard it again. A high, thin sound that wasn't quite whistling and wasn't quite singing. Probably just the wind through the rock formations, James suggested. This place is called Whistling Arch for a reason, right? We're still a few miles from the arch, I replied, but accepted his explanation anyway. The alternative, that someone else was out here making those sounds, was more unsettling. We turned in shortly after, tired from the day's hike. I fell asleep quickly despite the hard ground beneath my sleeping bag. I woke suddenly in the black hours of early morning. The fire had died to embers, casting a faint red glow over our campsite. James was snoring softly in his tent a few yards away. That sound again, the not quite whistling. Closer now. I sat up, straining to see through the darkness. The trees stood like sentinels around our clearing, their branches moving slightly in the breeze. But the sound wasn't coming from above. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the cliff edge. Grabbing my headlamp, I slipped out of my sleeping bag. The air was cold, my breath fogging before me as I moved cautiously toward the overlook. The lamp's beam cut a weak path through the darkness. 20 feet from camp, I stopped, listening. The sound had ceased. Then something moved at the edge of my light's reach. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. No response, but I had the distinct feeling I was being watched. Swinging my lamp in a wide arc, I caught a glimpse of something pale disappearing behind a boulder. "Who's there?" I moved forward, heart pounding. The whistling started again, but now it seemed to come from behind me. I spun around, my light beam dancing wildly over rocks and trees. Nothing. I retreated to camp, crawled back into my tent, and lay awake until dawn, the sound occasionally drifting through the night but never again coming close enough to investigate. When morning came, I debated whether to tell James. He already thought this trip was a waste of time. No need to make him more uncomfortable with tales of strange noises in the night. "Sleep okay?" he asked, boiling water for coffee on our small camp stove. "Fine," I lied. "You?" "Like a rock. Amazing what exhaustion will do." As we packed up camp, I noticed something odd about our site that I'd missed in the darkness. A series of small stones arranged in a rough circle around where we'd slept. They weren't random. Someone had placed them deliberately. "Did you do this?" I asked James, pointing to the stones. He frowned. "Do what?" "These stones. In a circle." James looked genuinely confused. "No, probably other campers before us." "Yeah, probably." But I hadn't noticed them when we set up camp. We hit the trail by mid-morning, heading deeper into the wilderness. The day was overcast, the sun a pale disk behind thin clouds. The forest felt different somehow, quieter, as if the birds and insects were holding their breath. Our route took us along a ridgeline before descending into a narrow hollow. The path grew less distinct here, sometimes disappearing altogether among tangles of mountain laurel and fallen logs. "You sure we're still on the trail?" James asked, pushing aside a thorny branch. I checked my compass. "Should be. The main trail picks up again about half a mile ahead." As we pushed through the undergrowth, I noticed strange markings on some of the trees, crude symbols carved into the bark. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still pale. "Look at this," I said, running my fingers over one of the marks. It resembled a stick figure with elongated limbs and no head. James examined it. "Vandals. Disrespectful assholes." "Maybe," I said, but something about the carvings made my skin crawl. They reminded me of the stone circle around our campsite, deliberate, purposeful. We continued on, the hollow growing darker as the trees closed in overhead. The air grew still and heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation. No breeze penetrated this deep. "I don't like this," James muttered. "Feels like we're being watched." So he felt it too. I was about to respond when we heard it, that same whistling sound from the night before, but louder now, coming from somewhere ahead of us. We both froze. "What is that?" James whispered. "I heard it last night too. I thought it was just the wind." The sound stopped, then started again, almost like it was beckoning us forward. "Let's go around," James suggested, his face pale. I checked the map. "We can't. The hollow's too steep on both sides. We need to follow the trail through." James looked unconvinced but nodded. We proceeded cautiously, our footsteps unnaturally loud in the weighted silence. The trail led us to a small clearing dominated by a massive old oak tree. Its trunk was wider than both of us could reach around, its sprawling branches creating a canopy over the entire space. The ground beneath it was bare, no undergrowth daring to grow in its shadow, and carved into its trunk was the largest of the symbols we'd seen, a crude humanoid figure with 2 long limbs and a circle where its head should be. "I really don't like this," James said, his voice tight. The whistling started again, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the branches above, from the ground below, from the very air around us. Then it shaped itself into words. "Mercer boys, come to play." James grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that? Tell me you didn't hear that." I couldn't speak. How did it know our name? "Like your daddy. Years ago." "We need to go," I managed, pulling James toward the far side of the clearing. "Now." We half ran, half stumbled down the path, the whistling voice following us, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, but always just out of sight. Can't leave now. Just arrived. The trail suddenly opened onto a wider path, and we found ourselves at an unexpected junction. A weathered wooden sign indicated we were at Ghost Branch Trail, a name I didn't recognize from my map. "Which way?" James gasped, looking back fearfully. I pulled out the map with trembling hands. "This doesn't make sense. Ghost Branch isn't on here." "Then how do we know where we are?" "Good question." I oriented the map as best I could and tried to calculate our position based on our morning's hike. "I think we need to go that way," I said, pointing north. "That should connect back to Bison Way eventually." We chose the North Fork, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The whistling had stopped, but the sense of being followed had not. After about 20 minutes, we reached another clearing, this one containing the stone foundation of what must have been an old cabin. Only the chimney remained fully intact, standing like a monument among the ruined walls. "Let's stop here," I suggested, needing a moment to catch my breath and reorient ourselves. "Just for a minute." James nodded, dropping his pack and sitting on a fallen log. "What the hell was that back there?" "I don't know." I unfolded the map again, trying to make sense of our location. "Maybe some local messing with hikers, playing on the area's reputation for being haunted." "They knew our name, Dan. Our last name." I had no explanation for that. As we rested, I examined the ruins more closely. The foundation stones were blackened, as if the cabin had burned down. Near the chimney, I spotted something metallic gleaming among the debris. Curious, I picked it up, a small, tarnished pocket watch. The glass was cracked, the hands frozen at 3:17. I pried it open and found an inscription inside. "To Thomas Mercer, May 15th, 1973. My blood went cold. Thomas Mercer was our father's name. "James," I called, my voice barely above a whisper, "come look at this." He crossed to me, took one look at the watch, and went pale. That's not possible." Our father had disappeared during a business trip to Kentucky in 1989. The official report said his car went off the road during a storm, but his body was never found. I was barely a year old. James was 7. Our mother rarely spoke of him. "Did you know he was ever here, in the gorge?" I asked. James shook his head. "Never. Mom said his accident was near Lexington." I turned the watch over in my hand. It felt impossibly heavy, like it was made of lead instead of brass. "We need to get out of here," James said, backing away from the ruins. Now. I pocketed the watch and nodded, the need to flee suddenly overwhelming. But as we turned to leave, we realized we weren't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadow of a large hemlock. It was tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze on us. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking. The figure didn't move or respond. It just watched. James was already backing away. "Dan, let's go. Please." I followed him, neither of us taking our eyes off the figure as we retreated down the trail. It made no move to follow, but somehow that was even more terrifying. We half ran, half hiked for what felt like hours, taking any path that seemed to lead away from the ruins. The sky darkened as afternoon bled into evening, but neither of us wanted to stop. The idea of spending another night in these woods was unbearable. Finally, exhaustion forced us to make camp in a small hollow next to a stream. We didn't bother with the fire, fearing it would draw attention. We ate cold trail mix and jerky in silence, jumping at every sound from the darkening forest. "What do you think that thing was?" James finally asked, his voice barely audible over the gentle burble of the stream. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it has something to do with Dad." James was quiet for a long moment. "I have a confession," he finally said. "I knew Dad had been to Kentucky before. Mom told me once when she was drunk on the anniversary of his disappearance. She said he'd come here on camping trips in college. And you never told me? It never seemed important. Just another piece of trivia about a man neither of us really knew." I pulled the pocket watch from my pocket, running my thumb over the inscription. "This means he was here, in this specific part of the gorge." "We don't know that for sure," James countered. "Someone could have brought it here later." "With his name inscribed in it, that's one hell of a coincidence." We fell silent again. The darkness was almost complete now, the overcast sky blocking any starlight. Our headlamps created small islands of light in the vast darkness. "We should try to sleep," I suggested, though the thought was almost laughable. "Take turns keeping watch." "I'll go first," James offered. I nodded and crawled into my sleeping bag using my pack as a pillow. Despite my racing thoughts and the hard ground, exhaustion soon pulled me under. I dreamed of the tall figure from the ruins. Only now I could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been was only smooth, pale skin. Yet somehow it was speaking to me, its voice that same whistling sound. "Son of Thomas, come to us." In the dream, I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure came closer, its two long fingers reaching for me. He never left. Neither will you. I woke with a gasp to find James shaking me. "Dan, wake up! You were making weird noises." I blinked, disoriented. "What? What time is it?" "About midnight. Your turn to watch." I sat up, rubbing my face. The dream had been so vivid, so real. "I had a nightmare," I explained, "about that thing we saw." James nodded, crawling into his own sleeping bag. "Try not to fall asleep again. I don't trust this place." I promised I wouldn't and took up my position on a rock overlooking our campsite. The night was eerily still, not even a breeze to rustle the leaves. The only sound was the gentle flow of the stream. About an hour into my watch, I heard a splash from the water. Thinking it might be a frog or fish, I pointed my headlamp toward the sound. Two eyes reflected the light back at me, eyes that were decidedly not animal. They were human in shape, but too large, too widely spaced on what I could now see was a pale, elongated face just breaking the surface of the water. I scrambled backward, nearly falling off my perch. "James!" I hissed. "James, wake up!" But when I looked back at the stream, the face was gone. Had I imagined it? James emerged from his sleeping bag, instantly alert. "What? What is it?" "I saw something in the stream. A face." We both stared at the water, but it showed only the gentle ripples of its current. "Maybe it was a fish," James suggested, though his tone said he didn't believe it. It had eyes, human eyes. A twig snapped in the forest behind us, then another. Something was moving through the trees, circling our camp. "Pack up," James whispered, quietly. We gathered our things as quickly and silently as possible, the sounds of movement growing closer. Just as we were about to leave, the whistling started again, this time from multiple directions. We were surrounded. Mercer boys, stay and play. Without a word, we ran, abandoning any pretense of stealth. We crashed through underbrush, splashed across the stream, and scrambled up the opposite bank, heading blindly into the forest. The whistle voices followed, sometimes seeming right at our heels, sometimes drifting away only to reappear ahead of us. Like father, like sons. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Just when I thought we couldn't go any farther, the trees thinned, and we found ourselves at the edge of a moonlit clearing. In the center stood a circle of standing stones, not the massive megaliths of ancient sites, but smaller stones about the height of a person, roughly hewn and placed in a perfect ring. They reminded me of the stone circle from our first campsite, but on a much larger scale. "What is this place?" James gasped, bending over to catch his breath. Before I could answer, the whistle voices rose to a crescendo around us, and dark shapes moved at the forest's edge. Tall, thin figures like the one we'd seen at the ruins, at least a dozen of them, encircling the clearing. "Inside," I said, pulling James toward the stone circle. "It's our only chance." We rushed into the circle, and as soon as we crossed the boundary between the stones, the whistling stopped abruptly. The figures remained at the forest's edge, watching but not approaching. "What are they?" James whispered, his voice ragged with fear. "I don't know." I turned slowly, taking in our surroundings. But they don't seem able to enter the circle. The center of the ring was bare earth, save for a flat stone that looked like it might serve as an altar or table, and on that stone lay a weathered leather journal. I approached cautiously and picked it up. The cover was cracked and faded, but still legible. Field notes: T. Mercer, Anthropology Dept., University of Cincinnati, 1973. "It's Dad's," I said, holding it up for James to see. With trembling hands, I opened the journal. The first pages contained standard anthropological observations about local geography and flora. But as I flipped further, the entries became more disturbing. May 20th, 1973. Local legends speak of hollow people who inhabit the deepest parts of the gorge. Described as unnaturally tall and thin, they're said to lure travelers from the trails. Most scholars dismiss this as typical backwoods superstition, but the consistency of accounts across generations is intriguing. June 3rd, 1973. Found strange markings on trees near Chimneytop Creek. Locals refused to discuss them. When I showed photos to my guide, he quit on the spot. No one else will take me into the Eastern Hollow. June 15th, 1973. I've been hearing whistling at night around my camp. Not natural, not human. Following up on a lead about a stone circle deep in the wilderness where the hollow people supposedly cannot enter. The entries continued, describing our father's growing obsession with the hollow people and his attempts to document their existence. The final entry, dated July 2, 1973, read, "I've found the circle." The stones are arranged in a pattern that matches no known Native American or European tradition. The center stone bears markings similar to those I found on the trees. Tonight I'll perform the ritual described in the old trapper's journal, not out of belief, but for thorough documentation. If nothing else, it should make for an interesting footnote in my dissertation. That was the last entry. Whatever ritual he'd performed, he hadn't recorded the results. Dad was researching local folklore, I said, looking up at James. These hollow people, they're what's been following us. James took the journal, scanning the pages with growing horror. But this was 1973. Dad disappeared in 1989. What was he doing in between? I shook my head, unable to answer. Outside the circle, the figures continued their silent vigil, occasionally shifting position but never approaching the stones. We need to stay here until daylight, I decided. They seem unable to enter. James nodded, sitting down with his back against the center stone. But what then? We still have to get back to the car, and I have no idea where we are. I pulled out the map, using my headlamp to study it. There was no indication of any stone circle, but if we could orient ourselves, we might be able to find our way back to a marked trail. As I studied the map, James continued reading the journal. Suddenly, he gasped. "Dan, look at this." He'd found a folded paper tucked into the back cover, a hand-drawn map of the gorge, far more detailed than the official trail map, and marked clearly on it was our current location, labeled The Sanctuary, along with paths connecting it to known trails. "This could get us out," I said, hope rising for the first time in hours. But James was staring at something else on the map, a small notation near the ruins we'd found earlier. Team Cabin, 1985. "Dad built that cabin," James whispered. "He was living out here for years." The implications were staggering. Our father hadn't disappeared in a car accident in 1989. He'd been living in the gorge, possibly since his research trip in 1973. But why? What had happened to him? And why had our mother lied? We had no answers, only the heavy weight of questions pressing down on us as we waited for dawn. The night stretched endlessly, the figures outside the circle never leaving, never speaking, just watching with their faceless patience. James and I took turns dozing, never fully sleeping for fear our sanctuary might not hold. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, I nudged James awake. "They're gone." The forest edge was empty, no sign of the hollow people who had surrounded us all night. We gathered our things quickly, studying the hand-drawn map to find the quickest route back to a marked trail. According to the map, we needed to head northwest from the circle, following a dry creek bed that would eventually connect with Ghost Branch Trail. "Should we really trust this?" James asked, eyeing the map dubiously. "Do we have a choice?" We left the safety of the stone circle, half expecting the whistling to start again, but the forest remained quiet. Almost too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our own breathing and footsteps. We found the dry creek bed easily enough and followed it through a ravine thick with mountain laurel and rhododendron. The going was slow, the terrain challenging, but the map proved accurate, leading us to Ghost Branch Trail after about 2 hours of hiking. From there, we were able to orient ourselves on the official map. We were still deep in the wilderness, but at least now we knew where we were and how to get back to the car, about 8 miles of hiking, most of it on marked trails. We made good time through the morning, pushing ourselves hard, driven by the desperate need to escape the gorge. By early afternoon, we reached Chimney Top Road, which would lead us back to the parking area. "We're almost there," I said, relief making my voice shake. James didn't respond. He'd been increasingly withdrawn as we hiked, lost in his own thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I have more memories of Dad than you do. Little things, mostly. The smell of his aftershave, the way he'd ruffle my hair when he came home from work." He paused. "But now I'm wondering if any of it was real. If the man I remember was actually living out here all along." I had no comfort to offer him. My own memories of our father were practically non-existent. just impressions formed more from photographs and family stories than actual recollection. We walked in silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. The trail joined a fire road, bringing us finally to the parking area where my Subaru waited, exactly as we'd left it 2 days ago, though it felt like years had passed. As we drove away from the gorge, a heavy fog began to roll in, cloaking the forest in gray. Through the mist, I thought I glimpsed tall, thin figures standing among the trees, watching our departure. But when I blinked, they were gone. Neither James nor I spoke much on the drive back to Cincinnati. What was there to say? We had discovered a truth about our father that raised more questions than it answered. Questions we might never find the answers to. I still had his pocket watch and journal. Perhaps somewhere in those pages was a clue to what had happened to Thomas Mercer, why he had abandoned his family to live in the wilderness, and what connection he had to the Hollow people. But part of me didn't want to know. Some truths are better left buried in the deep hollows of the gorge, where the whistling voices call in the darkness and pale figures watch from the trees with eyes that may or may not be there. James returned to his life in Columbus, his marriage still in shambles but now seeming like a trivial problem compared to what we'd experienced. We talk more often now, bound by a secret neither of us can share with anyone else. As for me, I've put away my hiking gear. The wilderness no longer calls to me. Instead, it whispers warnings. Sometimes at night, I think I hear that whistling sound outside my apartment window, but I never look. I keep the curtains drawn and try to convince myself it's just the wind. But I know better. The Hollow people found Thomas Mercer in the Red River Gorge, and now they've found his sons. It's only a matter of time before they call us back, and part of me, God help me, wants to answer. My name is Thomas Wilkins, and I am 33 years old. This happened in October 2023. The crackle of autumn leaves beneath my boots was the only sound accompanying me through the dense forest of Black Snake Mountain. Well, that and the occasional excited bark from Scout, my 3-year-old German Shepherd who bounded ahead of me on the narrow trail. Red October sunlight filtered through the canopy of maple and oak trees, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor that shifted with each gust of wind. "Easy, boy," I called as Scout disappeared around a bend in the trail. "Don't get too far ahead." I'd been planning this trip to Daniel Boone National Forest for months, a necessary escape from the suffocating reality of my desk job and the still raw pain of my divorce. 6 days of solitude in the Red River Gorge area was exactly what I needed to clear my head. At least, that's what I told myself when I packed up my Subaru and left Louisville behind. The guidebook had recommended this particular trail for its seclusion and pristine wilderness. One of Kentucky's best-kept secrets, it promised. The trail markers were few and far between, but I'd always prided myself on my navigation skills. Besides, I had my trusty GPS app, a paper map as backup, and Scout's surprisingly reliable instincts. What could possibly go wrong? I smiled to myself as Scout came trotting back, tongue lolling, seemingly pleased with whatever scent he'd discovered up ahead. "Finding anything interesting, buddy?" I scratched behind his ears as he pressed against my leg. For a moment, his ears perked up and he stared back the way we'd come, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What is it?" I turned, scanning the trail behind us. Nothing but trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Come on, you're being paranoid." We continued our hike, pushing deeper into the forest. According to my map, there was a small clearing about 3 miles in that would make an ideal campsite for our first night. We'd been on the trail for nearly 2 hours, and by my calculations, we should be approaching it soon. The forest seemed to grow thicker as we hiked, the trees pressing closer to the trail, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I noticed Scout staying closer to me now, no longer running ahead as he had earlier. Occasionally, he would stop and look over his shoulder, his posture tense. "It's just wildlife, buddy," I assured him, though I found myself glancing back more frequently too. The strange sensation of being watched had settled between my shoulder blades, that prickling awareness that makes the hairs on your neck stand at attention. As the afternoon wore on, I began to worry we'd somehow missed our turnoff. The clearing should have appeared by now, but instead, the trail continued to wind through increasingly dense forest. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but the signal kept cutting in and out, the blue dot of our location jumping erratically across the screen. "That's weird," I muttered, tapping the screen. The battery was already down to 63%, despite having been fully charged that morning. I switched it to battery saver mode and tucked it away. The first hint that something was truly wrong came when we crossed the same fallen log for the third time, distinctive because of the cluster of bright orange mushrooms growing from its side. I'd noticed them earlier, even snapped a photo. Now, here they were again, mocking me. "This doesn't make sense," I said aloud, unfolding my paper map. Scout whined softly beside me. "We've been going in a straight line, more or less. How are we crossing the same landmarks?" I studied the map carefully, trying to pinpoint our location. The problem was, there were few distinctive geographical features in this part of the forest to orient myself by. Just endless trees in every direction. As daylight began to fade, panic gnawed at my confidence. We needed to make camp soon, but the clearing remained elusive. Finally, I decided to veer off the trail and find a suitable spot among the trees. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I found a relatively flat area with enough space for my tent. As I began unpacking, Scout paced nervously around the perimeter of our makeshift campsite, his behavior increasingly agitated. "It's okay, boy. We'll figure this out in the morning," I said, more to comfort myself than him. Setting up camp gave me something productive to focus on. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire in a ring of stones. The familiar routine helped calm my nerves, though Scout's unease continued to bother me. He rarely strayed more than a few feet from me, and his eyes kept tracking movements in the forest that I couldn't see. Night fell with alarming swiftness, as if someone had thrown a dark blanket over the forest. I'd never experienced darkness quite like this, absolute and impenetrable beyond the small circle of firelight. The forest sounds changed too, the daytime chorus of birds replaced by mysterious rustlings and the occasional distant howl that didn't quite sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I heated a simple meal of dehydrated beef stew, sharing some with Scout, who ate quickly before resuming his vigilant guard. After dinner, I pulled out my map again, studying it by flashlight. Something about it bothered me. Landmarks that should have been there weren't, and the trail itself seemed to wind differently than I remembered from earlier. "Maybe I bought an outdated map," I muttered, folding it back up. That night in the tent, sleep came in fitful bursts. Scout lay pressed against me, occasionally growling softly at sounds I strained to hear. The darkness felt claustrophobic, pressing against the thin nylon walls of the tent like a living thing. Each time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by nightmares of being chased through an endless forest by something I couldn't quite see. During one of these wakeful periods, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the ground outside the tent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded almost like footsteps, but too light, too precise. Scout's entire body went rigid, his eyes fixed on the tent wall, a low growl building in his throat. "Shh," I whispered, my hand finding his collar. The tapping stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse, charged with expectation. I reached for my flashlight with trembling fingers. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the darkness. "Is someone there?" No response, just the weight of the forest pressing down around us. After what felt like hours, dawn finally arrived, gray light seeping reluctantly through the trees. I emerged from the tent feeling exhausted, my body stiff and my mind foggy. Scout bounded out after me, seemingly relieved to be in the open air again. He immediately ran to the edge of our campsite and began barking at something in the trees. "Scout! Quiet!" I hissed, not wanting to attract attention from whatever wildlife might be nearby. He ignored me, his barking becoming more frantic. I walked over to him, squinting into the dense undergrowth. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just more trees and fallen leaves. Then I noticed what had caught Scout's attention, a small cairn of stacked stones that definitely hadn't been there the night before. 7 smooth, dark stones balanced one atop the other. "What the hell?" I whispered, a chill running down my spine despite the morning warmth. Scout continued to bark at the stones, his hackles raised. I reached out tentatively and toppled the stack with a quick swipe of my hand. As the stones clattered to the ground, a flock of crows erupted from a nearby tree, their harsh cries shattering the morning quiet. My heart pounding, I quickly packed up camp, deciding to head back the way we'd come. Clearly, someone else was in these woods, someone who'd been watching us. The thought made my skin crawl, but finding our way back proved just as confusing as the day before. The trail seemed to shift and wind in unfamiliar ways, landmarks appearing where they shouldn't be, familiar features mysteriously absent. My phone's GPS continued to malfunction, the signal dropping completely for long stretches before returning with impossible locations. By midday, I was forced to admit we were hopelessly lost. The sun, occasionally visible through breaks in the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong position. Either my sense of direction had completely failed me, or something very strange was happening in these woods. "We'll just keep heading downhill," I told Scout, who trotted beside me with none of his usual enthusiasm. "Eventually, we'll hit a stream or a road." As we hiked, I noticed more cairns of stacked stones appearing with unsettling frequency along our path. Each time we encountered one, Scout would growl and I would feel that same crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. Some primal instinct told me to leave them alone now, so I did, giving them a wide berth as we passed. The day wore on, and the forest grew quieter, the usual bird calls and squirrel chatter conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the trees in an unnatural stillness. The only sound was our own movement through the underbrush and Scout's increasingly labored breathing. Late in the afternoon, we stumbled upon something that stopped me in my tracks. A small clearing with the charred remains of a campfire in the center, surrounded by disturbed earth and flattened grass. "This is our campsite from last night," I said in disbelief. Scout whined, pressing against my leg. "But that's impossible. We've been walking away from it all day." I stared at the burned-out fire, trying to make sense of our situation. How could we have walked in a perfect circle without realizing it? The clearing looked different somehow. The arrangement of trees not quite as I remembered, the dimensions slightly off. That's when I noticed the backpack leaning against a tree at the far edge of the clearing. It wasn't mine. Cautiously, I approached it. The pack was old and weathered, its once bright blue fabric faded to a dull gray. It looked as if it had been exposed to the elements for months, possibly years. With a trembling hand, I unzipped the main compartment. Inside was a jumble of standard camping equipment, a rusted mess kit, moldy rope, a water filter clogged with algae. At the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag that had protected it from the worst of the decay, was a small leather-bound journal. I slid it out and opened it to the first page. "My name is Marcus Fletcher, and I am 29 years old. This happened in May 2017. A chill ran through me as I read those words, so similar to what I might write myself. The journal detailed Marcus's solo hiking trip in these very woods. His early entries were enthusiastic, filled with observations about the local flora and fauna, but they quickly took a dark turn. Day 3. I think I'm going in circles. The landmarks don't match my map anymore. Found strange piles of stones everywhere. Someone's watching me. Day 5. The nights are wrong. Too long. Too dark. I hear whispering that doesn't sound human. My flashlight batteries died after just one night, even though they were brand new. Day 7. I saw her today. An old woman standing between the trees, just watching me. When I called out, she disappeared. My food is rotting even though it's sealed. Everything smells like decay. The entries grew increasingly erratic, the handwriting deteriorating into a frantic scrawl. The final entry, dated day 12, contained just 3 words. "She's coming closer." I closed the journal with shaking hands and stuffed it into my own pack. Scout was growing increasingly agitated, pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing, whining continuously. "We're getting out of here," I said firmly, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "Now!" As we prepared to leave, I heard it, a soft humming coming from the trees beyond the clearing. The melody was strange, atonal, raising goosebumps on my arms. Scout began to bark furiously in the direction of the sound. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The humming stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then came a response. Not in words, but in a high, keening sound that might have been laughter or crying. I couldn't tell which. Whatever it wasn't fully human. Scout's barking turned to frantic yelping as he backed away, pressing against my legs so hard I nearly lost my balance. That's when I saw her, exactly as Marcus had described. An elderly woman standing perfectly still among the trees, partially obscured by shadow. She wore what looked like an old-fashioned dress, dark and shapeless. Her hair hung in long, white tangles around a face that I couldn't quite make out clearly, no matter how hard I squinted. "Hello," I called again, my mouth dry. "Do you live around here? We're a bit lost." The figure didn't respond, but as I watched, she took one step forward, then another, moving with an odd, halting gait. There was something wrong about the way she moved, as if her joints bent in ways they shouldn't. Scout's barking turned to a pitiful whimper. I grabbed his collar, ready to run, when the woman suddenly stopped and cocked her head at an impossible angle, like a bird studying something curious. "This land remembers," she said, her voice a dry whisper that somehow carried clearly across the clearing. "It remembers what they did to me, Thomas." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone my name since entering the forest. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice hardly more than a whisper. "They called me Agnes Shearer when I had a name," she replied, "before they decided I was a witch, before they tied stones to my feet and threw me in the river yonder." She gestured vaguely to her right, though I knew of no river nearby. "The forest took me in after. The forest remembers too." I began slowly backing away, tugging Scout's collar to bring him with me. "I'm sorry about what happened to you," I said, not knowing what else to say to this apparition. "But I'm not part of that. I'm just a hiker who's lost." Agnes, if that's what she truly was, smiled then, revealing teeth that were too numerous and sharp to be human. "Everyone who comes here is lost, Thomas. Some more than others. That Fletcher boy, he was lost too. Fought hard, that one. Till the very end." My back hit a tree, and I realized I'd retreated to the edge of the clearing. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Company," she said simply. "It gets lonely here, even with the others." "Others?" I echoed. She gestured around the forest. "They stay. They all stay, eventually. Some take longer to accept it than others." As if on cue, I began to notice shapes moving among the trees, indistinct figures that never quite emerged into clear view. Some seemed to be walking purposefully, others standing still, watching. All of them were just slightly wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving in ways that human bodies shouldn't move. "You can't keep me here," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm leaving." Agnes's smile widened impossibly. "The forest doesn't let go easily, Thomas. But you can try. They all try." With that, she stepped backwards and seemed to melt into the shadows between the trees, disappearing from view. The other shapes retreated as well, leaving the forest seemingly empty once more, but the weight of being watched remained. I didn't wait around. Grabbing my pack and Scout's leash, I set off in what I hoped was the direction of the trailhead, moving as quickly as I dared through the increasingly dense underbrush. Scout no longer needed coaxing to stay close. He practically glued himself to my side as we fled. Night was approaching again, but I had no intention of making camp. I'd hike through the darkness if necessary. Anything to put distance between us and that clearing. My flashlight beam cut a feeble path through the gathering gloom as the sun disappeared with unnatural speed. As we hiked, I began noticing odd details about the forest around us. Trees that seemed to shift position when viewed from the corner of my eye, patches of ground where nothing grew, the earth black and scorched as if from intense heat, and everywhere those cairns of stacked stones appearing with increasing frequency. The darkness, when it came, was absolute. My flashlight beam seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the blackness. Worse, the battery was draining at an alarming rate, the light already dimming despite having been fully charged before the trip. The forest sounds changed too. What started as normal night noises, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, gradually transformed into something else, whispering voices just below the threshold of understanding. Footsteps that seemed to pace alongside us, always just out of sight. Once, a child's laughter, high and bright, from somewhere ahead of us. There are no children out here, I reminded myself aloud, the sound of my own voice providing momentary comfort. Scout suddenly stopped, his body rigid, staring ahead into the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. A low growl built in his throat, a sound of pure animal terror that made my heart race. I raised the flashlight, trying to penetrate the darkness ahead. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a pair of eyes reflected the light back at me. Not the green or yellow eyeshine of a forest animal, but milky white orbs that blinked slowly. "Hello, Thomas," came Agnes's dry whisper, much closer now. "Still trying to leave us?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with Scout at my heels. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to tangle my feet, but fear gave me a reckless speed. Behind us, I could hear movement in pursuit. Not the sound of human footsteps, but something that skittered and slithered through the forest with unnatural quickness. We ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. Finally, I collapsed against a tree trunk, gasping for breath. Scout huddled against me, trembling violently, his eyes wild with fear. As my breathing slowed, I realized the sounds of pursuit had ceased. The forest around us was silent again, save for our own labored breathing. My flashlight flickered weakly, the battery nearly exhausted despite having only been used for a short time. "We need to find shelter," I told Scout, stroking his head to calm both him and myself. "Just until daylight." In the feeble glow of my dying flashlight, I spotted a dark opening in a rocky hillside not far away. Some kind of small cave or rock shelter. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide some protection from whatever was hunting us through the forest. The cave was shallow but dry, the floor covered with dead leaves and debris. I swept away the worst of it and settled in with Scout, positioning myself where I could see the entrance. The flashlight gave one final flicker and died completely, plunging us into darkness. I don't know how long I sat there, back pressed against the cold stone, one arm around Scout's warm body. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the absolute darkness. Scout's occasional whimpers and the sound of his heart beating against my side were my only anchors to reality. I must have drifted off eventually, exhaustion overcoming fear. My dreams were chaotic and terrifying. I was running through an endless forest while the trees reached out to grab me with branch-like fingers. Agnes's voice echoed all around, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming, always saying the same thing. The forest remembers. I awoke with a start to find gray dawn light filtering into the cave. Scout was no longer beside me. "Scout!" I called, scrambling to my feet. "Scout!" Panic surged through me as I rushed to the cave entrance. The forest outside was shrouded in mist, the trees looming like silent sentinels. There was no sign of Scout. "Scout!" I shouted again, my voice echoing strangely in the mist. I whistled. the sharp sound cutting through the quiet morning air. In response, I heard a single bark, distant but unmistakably Scout's. It came from deeper in the forest, in the direction we'd fled from the night before. Without hesitation, I grabbed my pack and set off toward the sound, calling Scout's name continuously. The forest seemed different in the morning light, less menacing but more confusing. The mist twisted between the trees, creating spectral shapes that dissolved as I approached. I followed the sound of occasional barks, which always seemed to come from just ahead. As I walked, I realized with growing unease that I was being led back toward the clearing where we'd found Marcus Fletcher's backpack. "Scout!" I called again, more desperately now. "Come here, boy." A bark answered me, closer this time, followed by a pitiful whine that sent a surge of protective anger through me. Whatever was happening, Scout was in distress, and I needed to find him. When I finally broke through the trees into the now familiar clearing, I stopped short, my blood turning to ice in my veins. Scout was there, standing in the center of the clearing beside the remains of the campfire. But he wasn't alone. Agnes stood beside him, one gnarled hand resting on his head. Scout stood unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I'd never seen before. Distant, almost vacant. "He's a loyal creature," Agnes said, her fingers stroking Scout's fur. "They always are, until they become part of the forest, too." "Let him go," I said, my voice shaking with fear and rage. "He has nothing to do with this." Agnes smiled her too-many-teeth smile. "Everything in the forest belongs to the forest eventually, Thomas. Even you." As she spoke, I became aware of others emerging from the trees around the clearing, the indistinct figures I'd glimpsed before, now more clearly visible in the morning light. They were people, or had been once. Men and women of various ages, their clothing from different eras, all of them gaunt and pale with eyes that held the same vacant expression as Scout's. With a shock of recognition, I spotted a young man I instinctively knew was Marcus Fletcher, the pack still on his back, though now he seemed somehow insubstantial, like he was made of the same mist that swirled around our feet. "What do you want?" I asked, addressing Agnes but looking around at the gathered figures. "Why won't you let us leave?" "I told you," Agnes replied. "Company. The forest gets hungry for new souls, and those who disturb its peace must pay the price." "I didn't disturb anything," I protested. "I'm just a hiker." "This land was mine once," Agnes said, her voice taking on a hard edge. "Before they drove me out, called me witch, drowned me in the river. Now it's mine again, and all who enter must decide. Join us willingly or be taken anyway." As she spoke, the other figures began to move closer, forming a circle around the clearing. I noticed with mounting horror that some of them weren't fully solid. Parts of their bodies seemed to merge with the forest itself, arms becoming branches, legs disappearing into the ground like roots. "I can offer you peace, Thomas," Agnes continued, her voice gentler now. "No more struggling, no more pain. The forest accepts all, eventually." For a moment, I felt a strange pull, a whisper of temptation to simply give in, to join this macabre community and leave behind the complications of my life, the divorce, the dead-end job, the crushing loneliness that had driven me to seek solitude in these woods in the first place. It would be so easy to just stop fighting. Scout whined again, the sound breaking through my momentary weakness. His eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of his true self there, fighting against whatever hold Agnes had on him. "No," I said firmly, straightening my spine. "This isn't our place. We don't belong here." Agnes's face hardened, her features shifting subtly to become less human. "Then you'll join us the hard way, like Fletcher did." She snapped her fingers and the figures began to advance. At the same moment, Scout suddenly snapped out of his trance, snarling and breaking away from Agnes's grasp. He bounded toward me, positioning himself protectively at my side. "Run!" I shouted, turning to flee the clearing. But the forest itself seemed to be working against us now. Trees that hadn't been there moments before blocked our path. Roots erupted from the ground, grasping at our ankles. The very air grew thick and difficult to move through. I could hear Agnes's laughter behind us, along with the shuffle-slither sound of her followers in pursuit. Scout barked frantically, trying to find a way through the suddenly maze-like forest. We crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about direction, only escape. My pack caught on a branch and was torn from my shoulders, but I didn't stop to retrieve it. My clothes were ripped by thorns that seemed to reach out specifically to grasp us, my skin scratched and bleeding. Up ahead, I spotted a break in the trees, sunlight streaming through in a way that seemed different from the diffuse gray light elsewhere in the forest. Hope surged within me as I pushed toward it, Scout leading the way. As we approached the light, the forest's resistance intensified. The ground became boggy, each step requiring immense effort. The whispers around us grew to a crescendo, unintelligible words hammering at my consciousness. Agnes's voice rose above the others, no longer whispering but shrieking with rage. The forest remembers, the forest claims, the forest keeps. With one final, desperate lunge, Scout and I broke through the tree line and stumbled out onto a gravel road. The sudden transition was jarring. One moment surrounded by supernatural darkness and terror, the next standing in ordinary daylight beside what appeared to be a rarely used fire road. Behind us, the forest seemed to seethe with angry movement, but nothing emerged onto the road. A boundary had been crossed, one that Agnes and her followers couldn't or wouldn't breach. I collapsed onto the gravel, my legs no longer able to support me. Scout pressed against me, his body still trembling but his eyes clear again. We sat there for I don't know how long, both of us too exhausted and traumatized to move. Eventually, a forest ranger in a pickup truck found us. I mumbled something about getting lost, about losing my pack, about being chased by wild dogs, a story that made little sense but seemed more believable than the truth. The ranger, a kind-faced woman named Joanna, didn't press for details. She'd seen enough lost hikers to recognize genuine terror when she saw it. "Black Snake Mountain has a way of turning people around," she said as she drove us back to the ranger station. "Folks go missing there more often than the tourism board likes to admit." I wanted to ask her more, to see if she knew anything about Agnes Shearer or the strange happenings in those woods, but I couldn't bring myself to speak of it. Some primal instinct warned me that giving voice to what we'd experienced might somehow give it power, might draw Agnes's attention even now. Instead, I asked, "Have you ever heard of someone named Marcus Fletcher? He might have gone missing in these woods a few years ago." Joanna's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Name sounds familiar. There was a big search and rescue operation around 2017, if I recall correctly. Young guy, experienced hiker, they never found him." She glanced at me curiously. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, stroking Scout's head where it rested on my lap. "Just something I read online while researching hiking trails here." That was 3 months ago. Scout and I made it back to Louisville physically intact, if deeply shaken. I've tried to return to normal life, to convince myself that what happened in those woods was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by getting lost and the stress of isolation. But I know better. Sometimes at night, I still hear Agnes's whispers in my dreams. The forest remembers. The forest claims. The forest keeps. And worst of all, I've begun to find small cairns of stacked stones, 7 smooth, dark stones appearing in my backyard. Always in the morning, always positioned where they can be seen clearly from my bedroom window. Scout won't go into the yard anymore. He stands at the door, hackles raised, and whines plaintively whenever I try to coax him outside. Yesterday, I found Marcus Fletcher's journal in my mailbox, the same journal I'd left behind when I dropped my pack fleeing through the forest. There was a new entry at the back, written in handwriting that wasn't mine or the original owner's, spidery, ancient script that made my skin crawl. We're waiting for you to return, Thomas. The forest isn't finished with you yet. I'm moving next week, changing my name, heading west where there are no forests like the one in Kentucky. But deep down, I know it won't matter. Some part of me is still there, caught in Black Snake Mountain's grip, and sooner or later, like Marcus Fletcher before me, I'll have to go back. The forest remembers. The forest claims. The forest keeps. My name is Marcus Everett, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. Kentucky forests are never truly quiet. There's always some insect chirping, a bird calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But that morning, in my tent nestled deep in the Daniel Boone National Forest, there was nothing. Just the hollow sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of my sleeping bag as I shifted. It was my third day of what was supposed to be a week-long solo hiking trip. A reset, my therapist had called it. Something to help me process the divorce and the drinking that followed. Something to help me feel like myself again. Fresh air, Dr. Winters had said. Physical exertion, connection with nature. These are powerful medicines, Marcus. What she hadn't mentioned was the profound loneliness that comes with being truly alone in the wilderness. How your mind starts to play tricks on you when there's no one else around to ground you in reality. I unzipped my tent and crawled out into the chilly morning air. A thick fog had settled overnight, reducing visibility to about 20 feet in all directions. The trees, massive oaks and hickories, loomed like ghostly sentinels, their upper branches lost in the mist. My campsite was in a small clearing in Clifty Wilderness, one of the more remote areas of the forest, about 2 miles from the Red River Gorge. I fired up my small camp stove to make coffee, trying to ignore the unnatural silence. As the water began to heat, I finally heard something. A soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere in the fog. Tap, tap, tap. Like a woodpecker, but slower, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The sound stopped abruptly. After forcing down a breakfast of instant oatmeal, I packed up my gear. Today's hike would take me deeper into the wilderness, toward a place locals called Goblin's Hollow, an odd limestone formation that created a natural amphitheater in the forest. The trail wasn't on any official maps. A guy at the ranger station had told me about it, sketching a rough map on the back of my trail permit. Worth the detour, he'd said with a strange smile. Not many tourists know about it. Real pretty in the fall. My phone had no signal out here, but the GPS still worked. I plotted the coordinates the ranger had given me and set off, the fog gradually thinning as the morning progressed. The forest came alive again, birds singing, squirrels chattering, and I began to relax. The silence of the morning had just been a weird anomaly. Nothing more. By noon, I was deep in uncharted territory, following a barely visible trail that wound between towering rock formations. The limestone cliffs of this region were famous, carved by millions of years of water erosion into fantastical shapes. This area was particularly dramatic. Sheer rock faces 50 feet high, split by narrow passages that twisted like mazes. As I rounded a corner, the trail opened into a wide, circular depression about 100 feet across. The hollow. Steep limestone walls surrounded it on all sides, with just the narrow trail I'd come through as an entrance. The ground was surprisingly flat, covered in short, pale grass unlike the lush undergrowth of the surrounding forest. In the center stood a single massive oak tree, its trunk thick enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around it. There was something odd about the tree. As I approached, I realized what was bothering me. It was completely bare of leaves, despite it being early October when the other trees were just beginning to turn. Its massive branches stretched outward like skeletal fingers against the blue sky. I dropped my pack at the base of the tree and sat down, leaning against the rough bark as I pulled out my water bottle and a protein bar. The silence from that morning had returned. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through branches. Just a heavy stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. As I ate, I noticed markings on the tree trunk, old carvings in the bark, names and dates, some so weathered they were barely legible. Most were clearly old, the edges of the letters smooth with age. Samuel Warren, 1879, Elizabeth Crow, 1923, Timothy and June Holden, 1961, and dozens more, scattered all over the lower trunk. Some included brief messages. Found peace here. She spoke to me. I'm not alone anymore. The most recent one I could find was from 1993. Mark Jessup. She showed me the way. An odd collection of visitors over more than a century. I wondered what had drawn them all to this remote spot, what had compelled them to carve their names into this dead tree. Perhaps it was once a local tradition, now forgotten. I pulled out my pocket knife and, on impulse, added my own name and the date to the collection. The bark was surprisingly soft, yielding easily to my blade. Marcus Everett, 2023. As I carved the final digit, a drop of something warm hit my hand. I looked up, thinking perhaps a bird had flown over, but there was nothing above me but the bare branches of the oak. Another drop fell, this time landing on my cheek. I wiped it away and my fingers came back red. Blood. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the tree. More drops were falling now, oozing from the fresh cut I'd made in the bark. Not sap, blood, thick and red and metallic smelling. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared at the impossible sight. Tree sap could be red, I told myself desperately. Some kind of weird regional phenomenon, scientific explanation. But I knew what blood looked like, what it smelled like. A soft, whispering sound began to fill the hollow, like thousands of voices murmuring just below the threshold of hearing. I couldn't make out words, just a constant, sibilant hiss that seemed to come from the very air around me. I grabbed my pack and turned to run back the way I'd come, but stopped short. The entrance to the hollow was gone. Where the trail had been was now just solid limestone wall, the same as everywhere else in the circular depression. No, I said out loud, my voice sounding flat and dead in the strange acoustic space. No, no, no. I ran to where the entrance should have been, ran my hands over the cold stone, solid, seamless, as if it had never existed. The whispering grew louder, resolving into words I still couldn't quite catch. A woman's voice seemed to dominate, rising and falling in what might have been a song or a chant. I spun around, eyes darting to the rim of the hollow 50 feet above me. Could I climb out? The walls were steep, but not sheer. There were handholds, places where the rock had eroded. I wouldn't, said a voice behind me. I whirled around. A man was sitting at the base of the oak tree. He hadn't been there seconds before, I was certain of that. He was old, with weathered skin and white hair, dressed in clothes that seemed oddly old-fashioned. Brown trousers, a flannel shirt with a leather vest over it. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded. "How did you get in here?" The old man smiled. His teeth were stained yellow, one of them black with decay. "Same way as you, I expect. Followed the trail to the hollow. There's no trail anymore. It's gone." He nodded sagely. "That happens sometimes, when she's hungry." A cold feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. "When who's hungry?" Instead of answering, he pointed to the tree. "You carved your name. Shouldn't have done that. She considers it an invitation." "Who does? What are you talking about?" My voice had risen, echoing off the limestone walls. The whispering voices were growing louder, more insistent. "The keeper," the old man said as if it were obvious. "The spirit that lives in the tree, guardian of the hollow. Locals have known about her for generations." I shook my head. That's just superstition. Folk tales." The old man's smile widened. "Is it? Then how do you explain this?" He reached out and pressed his hand against the trunk of the oak. Blood welled up around his fingers, running down the bark in rivulets. "She's waking up. Your offering has stirred her hunger." I backed away from him, from the tree, until my back hit the limestone wall. "I didn't offer anything." "Blood and a name," the old man said, still smiling. "The oldest offering there is. A piece of your identity. And now she's curious about you, Marcus Everett." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. He hadn't been close enough to read what I'd carved. "What do you want from me?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Me? Nothing at all." He stood up and stretched, his joints popping loudly. "I'm just the caretaker. Been watching over this place for a long time, making sure she gets what she needs." "And what is that?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. The old man's eyes, which had seemed pale blue, suddenly looked different, darker, with vertical pupils like a cat's. "Sustenance," he said, and his voice had changed too, layered now with other voices, higher and lower than his natural tone. "She feeds on fear, on pain, on the life force of those who are lost." The temperature in the hollow seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. My breath fogged in front of my face. "You're not real," I said, but my voice shook. "None of this is real. I'm hallucinating or dreaming or—" "Oh, I assure you," the old man said, taking a step toward me. "This is very real. More real than the life you left behind, your empty apartment, your failed marriage, your dead-end job. Here, you could be part of something ancient, something powerful." He knew things about me, things I hadn't told anyone out here. "What are you?" I whispered. The old man tilted his head, an oddly inhuman gesture. "A servant, a harbinger. 1,000 years ago, they might have called me a familiar." He smiled again, and now his teeth looked wrong. Too many, too sharp. "The keeper needs a new caretaker. The old one is wearing out." With horror, I realized he was talking about himself. His face seemed to be aging before my eyes, the skin sagging, wrinkles deepening, his hair thinning to reveal liver spots on his scalp. "I've served for over a century," he continued, his voice growing reedy and weak. "Since 1879. Samuel Warren, at your service." He gave a mocking little bow. "The first name on the tree." "That's impossible," I said automatically. "The keeper extends life, but there's a price, and now she's chosen you to take my place." I shook my head violently. "No, I'm leaving. Now." I turned back to the wall and began searching desperately for a way to climb out. Samuel's laughter followed me. "You can try. Others have. They never get far." I ignored him, finding a fingerhold in the limestone and pulling myself up. The rock was cold and slick under my hands, but I managed to ascend about 10 feet before my foot slipped and I fell hard on my back, the air driven from my lungs. As I lay there gasping, Samuel appeared above me, looking down with those inhuman eyes. "She'll keep bringing you back," he said softly. "Better to accept the gift she's offering." "What gift?" I wheezed. "Power, long life, knowledge of things mortals shouldn't know." He offered his hand to help me up. I ignored it, rolling away and staggering to my feet on my own. "I don't want any of that." Samuel shrugged. "Then you'll die here, and she'll take your essence anyway. The choice is yours." The whispering voices had grown so loud now that they seemed to be coming from inside my own head. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. "Stop it!" I shouted. "Leave me alone." Samuel's expression turned pitying. "It's already too late. You offered yourself when you carved your name. The ritual has begun." As if on cue, the ground began to tremble. The short grass covering the hollow floor rippled like water. At the base of the oak tree, the earth split open, a long, jagged crack that widened as I watched in horror. From within the crevice, something began to emerge, something that gleamed wetly in the afternoon light. Roots, but not like any tree roots I'd ever seen. These were reddish-pink, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my terrified heartbeat. They looked almost vascular, like massive exposed arteries erupting from the ground. The pulsing roots spread across the hollow floor, growing at an impossible speed. I retreated until my back hit the limestone wall again. There was nowhere else to go. Samuel watched impassively as the unnatural roots crawled closer to me. "Don't fight it," he advised. "It hurts less if you don't resist." One of the roots reached my foot and curled around my ankle. It was warm and slick, and I could feel it pulsing against my skin. I screamed and kicked out, trying to dislodge it, but its grip was like iron. More roots converged on me, wrapping around my legs, my waist, my chest. They weren't just holding me. They were sinking into me, piercing my clothes, my skin, seeking my veins. The pain was indescribable. Like being invaded from the outside in, my blood vessels commandeered by this alien presence. Samuel stepped closer, watching with clinical interest as I struggled. "The union is beginning," he said. "Soon you'll feel her thoughts, her hunger, her age." As if triggered by his words, a flood of foreign sensations poured into my mind. Ancient memories that weren't mine, centuries of watching from the hollow as the world changed around it. Decades of feeding on lost travelers, wanderers, the curious who ventured too close. The taste of fear, the sustenance of pain and hunger. A bottomless, aching hunger that had existed for millennia and could never be fully satisfied. "No," I screamed, fighting against both the physical invasion and the mental one. "I won't become this. I won't be your replacement." Something flickered across Samuel's inhuman face. Surprise, and something that might have been respect. "Most don't fight this hard," he admitted, "but it won't matter in the end." But I wasn't listening anymore. In the flood of alien memories invading my mind, I'd caught a glimpse of something important. Knowledge of how the Keeper had come to be. How it had been bound to this place centuries ago by indigenous rituals, contained but not destroyed, and if it could be bound, it could be released. I stopped struggling against the roots physically and instead focused all my energy on the mental battle. I pushed back against the invading consciousness, creating a wall around my own thoughts. For a moment, the pressure eased. The Keeper seemed surprised by my resistance. Samuel frowned. "What are you doing?" I didn't answer him. Instead, I began to recite everything I could remember from my childhood Catholic education. Prayers, psalms, anything that represented structure and faith. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The roots tightened painfully, but I kept going. "Hallowed be thy name." Samuel's expression turned to alarm. "Stop that. She doesn't like it." "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." The whispering voices rose to a shriek. The roots shuddered against my skin. "On earth as it is in heaven." Samuel lunged forward, his hand outstretched to cover my mouth, but he was too slow. "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses." The ground rumbled. Cracks appeared in the limestone walls. "As we forgive those who trespass against us." The roots began to withdraw, sliding out of my flesh with a sickening, slick sound. I collapsed to my knees but kept reciting, my voice growing stronger. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Samuel was transforming before my eyes, his human appearance melting away to reveal something else, something with too many limbs, skin like bark, eyes that glowed with the same pulsing rhythm as the roots. "You can't undo what's begun," he hissed, his voice no longer remotely human. "She's already tasted you, marked you." I ignored him, finishing the prayer with every ounce of conviction I could muster. "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." The effect was instantaneous. The oak tree at the center of the hollow shuddered violently. The blood that had been oozing from its bark turned black and viscous. The roots that had withdrawn from my body whipped around frantically as if in pain. And Samuel, or the thing that had been Samuel, screeched, a sound no human throat could produce. "What have you done?" I staggered to my feet, feeling blood trickling from the wounds where the roots had penetrated my skin. But my mind was clear now, free from the alien invasion. "Breaking the connection," I gasped. "Faith against your false promises. My will against hers." The creature that had been Samuel rushed at me, its transformed limbs reaching for my throat. I dodged aside, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I possessed. "You'll die here," it shrieked. "We'll both die. Without a caretaker, she'll consume everything in the hollow." As if confirming his words, the crevice at the base of the oak widened suddenly. The tree itself began to tilt, roots that had been buried for centuries now exposed. The ground shook violently, knocking me off my feet again. The limestone walls of the hollow were cracking, chunks of rock breaking free and tumbling down, and there, where the entrance had been, a sliver of daylight appeared. The way out was returning. Samuel saw it too. With inhuman speed, he scrambled toward the opening. I lunged after him, grabbing what was left of his clothing. We both tumbled to the ground, rolling dangerously close to the widening crevice. "Let me go," he shrieked. "I've served for a century. I deserve to be free." "After how many deaths?" I shouted back. "How many people did you lure here to feed your mistress?" His transformed face contorted in rage. They were nothing. Insignificant lives. I gave them meaning. With strength born of desperation, I heaved us both toward the crevice. Samuel realized my intent too late. He clawed at the ground, at me, leaving deep gouges in my arms, but I didn't let go. "You belong to her," I growled through gritted teeth. "You made your choice 100 years ago." We teetered on the edge of the abyss. Below, I could see the pulsing roots gathered in a writhing mass, like some grotesque heart exposed to the air. Samuel's inhuman eyes widened in terror. "Please," he begged, his voice briefly human again. "Don't do this. You don't understand what it's like down there." For a moment I hesitated. Then I remembered the names carved on the tree, all the lives this creature had sacrificed to extend its own existence. "May God have mercy on your soul," I said, and pushed us both over the edge. We fell. Samuel's unearthly scream filled my ears. The pulsing roots rose to meet us, eager to reclaim their servant. In the last possible moment, I twisted in midair, catching the edge of the crevice with one hand. My shoulder wrenched painfully in its socket, but I held on. Samuel wasn't so lucky. The roots enveloped him instantly, pulling him down into the pulsing mass. His screams turned liquid, then stopped altogether. With every bit of strength I had left, I hauled myself back up over the edge. The ground was still shaking, the hollow collapsing in on itself. The opening to the forest was now wide enough to pass through. I crawled toward it, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through my wounded body. Behind me, the great oak finally toppled with a deafening crack, plunging into the crevice. The roots writhed in what looked like agony. I reached the opening and squeezed through, tumbling down a short slope to land on the forest floor beyond. Normal forest sounds flooded my ears. Birds, insects, wind in the leaves. The air smelled clean and natural after the metallic stench of the hollow. I lay there for what felt like hours, breathing in the sweet air, feeling the afternoon sunlight on my face. Eventually, I found the strength to stand and look back. Where the entrance to Goblin's Hollow had been, there was now only solid rock face, as if the opening had never existed. But carved into the stone, fresh enough that dust still clung to the edges, was a name. Samuel Warren, 1879-2023. Below it, in my own handwriting, Marcus Everett. But no death date for me. I turned away and began the long walk back toward civilization, my body aching, blood still seeping from the puncture wounds left by the roots. I didn't look back again. It took me 2 days to reach the ranger station, delirious from blood loss and dehydration. They rushed me to the hospital in Lexington, where doctors struggled to explain my injuries. I told them I'd fallen onto a deadfall of broken branches, a lie they clearly didn't believe but couldn't disprove. The physical wounds healed eventually. The nightmares haven't stopped. In them, I'm back in the hollow, but this time I don't escape. The roots take me, make me the new caretaker. I wake up tasting blood and dirt. Sometimes I think I hear whispering voices, even in the brightness of day. And sometimes when I pass trees in the city park near my apartment, I swear their branches reach for me just slightly, just enough that I could convince myself I imagined it. But the strangest thing is this. The ranger I spoke to when I recovered, the one who had given me directions to Goblin's Hollow in the first place, didn't exist, according to the staff records. No one matching his description had ever worked at the Daniel Boone National Forest Station. I've tried to research Goblin's Hollow since then. There's nothing in any official forest documentation, nothing in local history books. The closest I've come is a brief mention in a collection of Kentucky folk tales, a single paragraph about a place called the Hungry Hollow, where a witch was supposedly buried beneath an oak tree in the 1700s. I haven't gone hiking since. I can't even bring myself to walk in wooded parks anymore. The trees watch me, I'm sure of it. Waiting, patient as only something that lives for centuries can be. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I truly escaped, or if this is just another form of imprisonment. Freedom as an illusion while I spread the story of the hollow, planting curiosity in other minds that might seek out what I found. Because that's how it works, isn't it? The story spreads, the curious come searching, and the keeper waits, hungry as always. My name is Marcus Everett, and this is my warning. Stay out of Goblin's Hollow. If a ranger with pale blue eyes offers to show you a secret place in the forest, walk away. Some secrets are kept for a reason, and if you ever find yourself in a perfect circular clearing with a single dead oak at its center, run. Run, and don't look back. Don't carve your name into anything. Don't make the offering, because once you're marked, you're never truly free. My name is Marcus Harlow, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. The first snow of the season was falling as I pulled into the small gravel lot at the Red River Gorge trailhead. Flakes drifted lazily through my headlights, settling on the windshield before the wipers swept them away. It was earlier than I had planned, the sky still inky black with just a hint of gray on the eastern horizon, but I wanted to get a full day on the trail. The weathered sign at the trailhead bore warnings of increased bear activity and reminders to store food properly. I'd been hiking these Kentucky trails since I was a teenager, so none of this was new to me. What was new was doing it alone. Rachel would have loved this. The pristine wilderness, the crisp air, the way the October light would eventually filter through the autumn leaves. But Rachel was gone. 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days gone. The cancer had taken her quickly, leaving me with an empty house, her hiking gear gathering dust in the corner of our bedroom, and the memory of a promise I'd made to her in those final days at the hospice. "Don't stop living, Marcus," she'd whispered, her hand frail in mine. "Go back to the gorge. Remember our first trip?" Of course I remembered. It was where I'd proposed to her 7 years ago. We'd returned every October since, until last year when she was too sick to make the journey. Now, I was here to scatter some of her ashes at Angel's window, her favorite outlook in the gorge. It felt right to fulfill this last request before winter fully set in. I shouldered my pack, feeling the familiar weight settle against my spine. Rachel's ashes were wrapped carefully in her favorite bandana, nestled between my spare clothes and the first aid kit. I'd brought enough supplies for 3 days, though I only planned to be out for 2. Better safe than sorry, especially when hiking alone. The trail started easy enough, a gentle slope winding through stands of oak and hickory trees. The snow was light, barely sticking to the ground, but the air held the unmistakable bite of winter approaching. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked, the only sound my boots crunching on the leaf-littered path and the occasional distant call of a bird. About an hour in, the path narrowed as it followed the ridgeline. To my right, the land fell away dramatically, revealing the gorge below, a vast expanse of forest painted in reds and golds, bisected by the silver thread of the Red River. In the growing light, the mist hung in the valleys like a ghostly sea. I stopped to take a photo, wishing I could send it to Rachel. She would have appreciated the way the early light played through the fog. The thought sent a familiar ache through my chest. "Look at that view, Rach," I whispered to the empty air. Talking to her had become a habit I didn't want to, break. I continued hiking as the day brightened. The trail was marked with blue blazes, though in some places they were faded or missing altogether. Not that I was worried. I'd studied the maps carefully before setting out, marking the route to Angel's Window and planning where I would camp tonight. By midday, I'd made good progress. The snow had stopped and the sun occasionally broke through the clouds, warming my face. I paused to eat a sandwich, leaning against a large boulder overlooking another spectacular view of the gorge. That's when I first noticed something odd. A rustling in the underbrush about 30 yards down the trail. I waited, expecting to see a deer or maybe a wild turkey, but nothing emerged. Just as I was about to dismiss it, I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark slipping between the trees. "Hello?" I called out, feeling slightly foolish. It was probably just an animal. No response came, but the rustling stopped. I packed up and continued hiking, but now I found myself glancing over my shoulder more frequently. The forest that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt watchful, the shadows between the trees deeper than they should be. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The grief playing tricks on my mind. Rachel would have laughed at me for being jumpy. By late afternoon, I reached my planned campsite, a small clearing near Swift Camp Creek, about 2 miles from Angel's Window. I'd make the final push to the Outlook in the morning, perform the small ceremony for Rachel, and then head back. The site was perfect. Flat ground, a nearby water source, and a makeshift fire ring left by previous campers. I set up my tent efficiently, gathered firewood, and had a small fire crackling by the time the sun began to set. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I was grateful for the warmth as I heated water for my freeze-dried beef stew. Not gourmet dining, but it would do. As darkness settled over the forest, the sounds changed. The daytime birds went quiet, replaced by the occasional hoot of an owl and the constant background chorus of insects. The fire cast dancing shadows on the trees surrounding my little clearing, creating shapes that seemed to move even when there was no breeze. I was just about to crawl into my tent when I heard it. A crack like a branch breaking, too heavy to be caused by any small animal. It came from the darkness beyond the firelight in the direction I'd be hiking tomorrow. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. "Anyone there?" Nothing, just the soft burble of the creek and the pop of the fire. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest at night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I added more wood to the fire, building it higher than I normally would. The extra light revealed nothing unusual in the surrounding trees, yet the uneasiness persisted. Inside my tent, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the night sounds. Sleep eluded me as my mind replayed that glimpse of movement from earlier in the day. Had it been a person? Another hiker, perhaps? But why wouldn't they have responded when I called out? I must have eventually dozed off because I jerked awake suddenly, disoriented. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull red glow through the tent fabric. Something had woken me. A sound? A dream? I wasn't sure. Then I heard it. A voice so faint I might have imagined it. "Marcus." My heart slammed against my ribs. It had sounded like Rachel. "Marcus, help me." I fumbled for my headlamp, hands shaking. The rational part of my brain said this couldn't be happening, but the voice had been so clear, so unmistakably hers. I unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. The night was utterly still, the only light coming from the dying embers and a sliver of moon visible through the trees. "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin and frightened. Nothing. No movement, no sound except the gentle gurgle of the creek. I was about to retreat back into the tent when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the thin layer of snow around my campsite. Not mine, and they hadn't been there when I'd set up camp. They circled my tent completely before leading off into the woods in the direction of Angel's window. I grabbed my flashlight, a powerful one that Rachel had insisted I bring on all our trips, and shone it on the tracks. They were clearly human, but something about them was off. The stride was too long, and they seemed deeper at the toes than the heels, as if whoever or whatever had made them had been walking on the balls of their feet. I followed the beam of my flashlight along the trail of footprints until they disappeared into the darkness between the trees. My instincts screamed at me to pack up and hike out now. Night be damned. But something stronger held me in place. The memory of Rachel's voice calling for help. It couldn't have been her. I knew that. Her ashes were in my backpack. This was grief and isolation playing cruel tricks on my mind. And yet, I quickly built the fire back up, adding enough wood to keep it going for hours. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat with my back against a tree, facing the direction the footprints had gone, flashlight in one hand and my hunting knife in the other. The hours crawled by. Occasionally, I'd hear rustling in the underbrush or the snap of a twig, but nothing came into the circle of firelight. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, my eyes were gritty with exhaustion, and my back ached from sitting upright all night. In the gray morning light, I examined the footprints again. They were still there, eliminating the slim hope that I'd imagined them. But now I noticed something else, a strange smell hanging in the air, like wet earth and something rotten. I should have left. Packed up and hiked back to my car, forgetting about Angel's window and my promise to Rachel. That would have been the smart thing to do, but the thought of leaving without completing what I'd come for was unbearable. Rachel had asked for so little in those final days. I couldn't fail her now, so I made coffee, ate a protein bar, and packed up camp. The footprints led in the same direction I needed to go anyway. Angel's window was less than 2 miles away. I'd be there in an hour, do what I came to do, and then get out. The morning was cold but clear as I set off, following the blue blazes marking the trail. I tried to focus on the beauty around me, the way the sunlight filtered through the red and gold leaves, the mist rising from the valley below, but my eyes kept darting to the sides of the trail, searching for movement. About half a mile in, I noticed that the forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. Then I found the first carving. It was cut deep into the trunk of an old oak tree that stood right beside the trail, a crude symbol that looked like a stick figure with too many limbs. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood pale against the dark bark. 20 yards further, another tree bore the same mark, and another beyond that. They formed a line leading deeper into the forest, away from the marked trail. I checked my map, confirming that Angel's window was still straight ahead if I stayed on the trail. These carvings were trying to lead me astray. A cold sweat broke out across my back despite the chill in the air. "I'm not following your breadcrumbs," I muttered, continuing along the proper trail. That's when I heard the voice again. "Marcus, please." It came from the direction of the carvings. Rachel's voice, but with something wrong in it. A hollow quality, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. I froze, my heart hammering. "You're not her," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "Rachel is dead." A laugh answered me, high and thin, nothing like Rachel's warm chuckle. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. I quickened my pace, practically jogging now, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Angel's window wasn't far. I'd do what I came to do and get the hell out of these woods. The trail steepened as it approached the outlook. My breath came in ragged gasps, as much from fear as exertion. The trees thinned, and suddenly there it was. Angel's window, a natural stone arch framing a view of the gorge that seemed to stretch endlessly to the horizon. Under different circumstances, I would have stopped to appreciate the beauty, to remember the day I'd proposed to Rachel here, how her eyes had filled with tears as she said yes. But now I just wanted to complete my task and leave. I shrugged off my backpack and carefully removed the bandana containing Rachel's ashes. The wind had picked up, rippling through the canopy below and bringing with it the earthy scent of the forest. "I made it, Rach," I said softly, untying the bandana, just like I promised. But as I prepared to open the fabric, a voice spoke from directly behind me. "Did you, Marcus? Did you really?" I spun around so fast I nearly lost my footing on the rocky overlook. A woman stood there at the edge of the trees. From a distance, she might have passed for Rachel. The same height, similar build, dark hair falling to her shoulders. But up close, everything was wrong. Her skin had a grayish cast to it, like clay left too long in the sun. Her eyes were too large for her face, the pupils expanded so far that no iris was visible. And her mouth. When she smiled, I could see that her teeth were filed to points. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, clutching the bandana to my chest. "Don't you recognize me?" the thing said in Rachel's voice, taking a step closer. "It's me, your wife. I've been waiting for you." I backed up until I felt the edge of the outcropping behind me. Far below, the gorge waited, a dizzying drop to the valley floor. "You're not Rachel," I said, finding a strange calm in absolute terror. "Rachel died in hospice." I held her hand as she went. The creature's smile widened unnaturally, splitting its face almost to the ears. "And yet, here I am. Don't you want to hold me again, Marcus? Don't you miss me?" It extended a hand toward me. The fingers were too long, the nails curved like talons. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What any lonely soul wants," it said, taking another step closer. "Company." I glanced behind me at the sheer drop, then back at the thing wearing a twisted version of my wife's face. There had to be a way out of this. "The locals call me Laurel," the creature continued, her voice shifting, becoming less like Rachel's and more like something ancient and hungry. "But I've had many names over the centuries. The Cherokee who first lived in these hills knew to leave offerings for me. Food, trinkets, sometimes even sacrifices. But people these days—" She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "They've forgotten the old ways. They wander into my hollow without proper respect." "Your hollow," I repeated, trying to keep her talking while I looked for an escape route. To my left, the trail continued past Angel's window, eventually looping back to the main path. "Swift Camp Creek Hollow," she said, gesturing to the valley below. "My domain, for longer than your kind, has had a name for these mountains." I remembered now, stories I'd dismissed as local folklore. The witch of Swift Camp Creek, a malevolent spirit said to lure hikers off the trail, never to be seen again. "Those who enter my hollow must pay a toll," Laurel continued, her smile never wavering. "Usually, I take a trinket of meaning, a wedding ring, a cherished photograph. But you, Marcus—" She inhaled deeply, as if scenting the air. "You bring me ashes. Death already touched. That won't do at all." She lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingers closing around my wrist. Her touch was ice cold, sending pain shooting up my arm as if my very life force was being drained away. "I think I'll take you instead," she hissed, her face inches from mine now. "Your grief is so delicious, so pure. You'll sustain me for years." In that moment, survival instinct took over. I brought my knee up hard between us, connecting with her abdomen. She let out a shriek that no human throat could produce and loosened her grip just enough for me to twist away. I ran, not toward the trail as she might expect, but straight at her, shoulder lowered. The impact sent us both sprawling, but I scrambled to my feet first and sprinted for the path, still clutching Rachel's ashes. Behind me, Laurel's inhuman scream echoed through the gorge. I didn't look back, focusing only on the trail ahead, my boots pounding against the earth. I had perhaps a minute's head start at most. The main trail forked about half a mile ahead. Right would take me back to my car, but it was longer, at least 5 miles of winding path. Left led deeper into the gorge but would eventually connect with a Forest Service road. If I could reach that road, I might find help. I chose left, reasoning that Laurel would expect me to head back the way I'd come. The path descended sharply, switchbacking down into the hollow. Her hollow, I reminded myself with a shudder. The forest grew denser as I descended, the trees closing in until they formed a canopy so thick that little sunlight penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably. My breath clouded in front of me despite it being midday. I could hear her now, crashing through the underbrush somewhere behind me. She wasn't bothering with stealth anymore. The sound drove me forward even as my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. The trail leveled out as it reached the creek, the water rushing over moss-covered rocks. I splashed across at a shallow point, hoping the moving water might confuse my scent or whatever means she was using to track me. On the other side, I paused just long enough to consult my map. The Forest Service road should be less than a mile ahead if I continued following the creek downstream. That's when I noticed the carvings again. The same strange stick figure with too many limbs, freshly cut into the trees along the creek. They hadn't been made by random hikers or bored teenagers. They were trail markers for Laurel's hunting ground. I folded the map and ran again, following the creek. The undergrowth was thicker here, briars catching at my clothes and scratching my exposed skin. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit had quieted, which was somehow more terrifying than hearing her crash through the forest. The creek widened, becoming swifter, white water churning around larger boulders. The roar of a waterfall reached my ears just before I saw it, a 20-foot cascade dropping into a deep pool before the creek continued its journey. The trail split here. One path followed the ridge above the waterfall, the other descended beside it. Neither looked recently used, but the lower path seemed to head in the direction of the Forest Service road according to my map. I took the lower path, picking my way carefully down the slick rocks beside the waterfall. Spray dampened my face and clothes, making the footing treacherous. One slip, and I'd plunge into the churning pool below. Halfway down, movement caught my eye. A figure standing at the top of the falls where I'd just been. Laurel. She wasn't running anymore, but watching me with those 2 large eyes, her unnatural smile visible even at this distance. She raised a hand in what almost seemed like a farewell gesture. Too late, I realized what she was doing. The rock beneath my feet shifted, not naturally, but as if pushed by an unseen force. I lost my balance, arms pinwheeling desperately as I tried to grab onto something, anything. Then I was falling, plummeting toward the pool below, Rachel's ashes still clutched in one hand. The impact with the water drove the air from my lungs. The current immediately seized me, tumbling me over and over as it carried me downstream. I fought to the surface, gasping for air. The creek had me in its grip, sweeping me along too fast to get my bearings. Rocks bruised my back and legs as I was dashed against them. My head went under again and I swallowed water, choking as I broke the surface once more. Ahead, the creek narrowed, the water funneling between 2 large boulders. If I went through that gap at this speed, I'd be torn apart. With my free hand, I made a desperate grab for a tree root protruding from the bank. My fingers closed around it, and I felt my shoulder wrench painfully as the current tried to tear me away. But I held on, pulling myself gradually toward the shore, fighting against the rushing water every inch of the way. Finally, I dragged myself onto the muddy bank, coughing up creek water and shivering uncontrollably. I still had the bandana with Rachel's ashes, soaked but intact. My pack was gone, along with my map, most of my supplies, and my phone. All I had was what was in my pockets, A small folding knife, a lighter, and a granola bar. I lay there for several minutes, just breathing, trying to process what had happened. The thing calling itself Laurel was real. The stories were real. And she wanted me, not just to kill me, but to keep me somehow, to feed on my grief. When I could move again, I took stock of my situation. I was soaking wet in October in Kentucky, with temperatures likely to drop below freezing after dark. I had no idea exactly where I was, except somewhere downstream from the waterfall. The Forest Service road could be nearby or miles away, and somewhere in these woods, Laurel was hunting me. I had to keep moving. Staying still meant death from either exposure or the witch. I chose to continue following the creek downstream, reasoning that it would eventually lead to civilization, or at least the Forest Service road I'd been aiming for. The light was beginning to fade now, the shadows lengthening between the trees. Without my headlamp or flashlight, I'd be blind once night fell completely. I needed shelter, and I needed fire. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found a small clearing where a lightning-struck tree had opened a gap in the canopy. Dried leaves had collected in a hollow at the base of the dead tree, providing potential kindling. It wasn't ideal, too exposed, but with darkness approaching, I had little choice. I gathered what dry wood I could find and used my knife to shave some into fine curls for tinder. My hands shook from cold and exhaustion as I worked, but the familiar task helped calm my racing thoughts. The lighter caught on the third try, the flame tiny and precious in the gathering gloom. I held it to the tinder, nursing the flame until it took hold, then carefully added larger pieces of wood. Soon, I had a small fire going, not large enough to be seen from a distance, but enough to provide some warmth. I stripped off my wet outer layers and hung them on branches near the fire to dry. The heat was blissful against my chilled skin, and for the first time since encountering Laurel, I felt a flicker of hope. I could survive this. I just needed to make it through the night and find my way out in the morning. As full darkness descended, I kept the fire fed and tried to formulate a plan. Without a map, I was navigating blind, but water always flowed downhill, and this creek had to eventually join the Red River. If I followed it long enough, I'd find roads, houses, people. The sounds of the forest at night were different here in the hollow than they had been up on the ridge. The constant rush of the creek provided a backdrop to the calls of night birds and the rustle of nocturnal creatures. I found myself straining to distinguish normal forest sounds from anything that might signal Laurel's approach. Hours passed. My clothes had dried and I'd put them back on, huddling close to the fire for warmth. Sleep tugged at me, but I fought it off, afraid of what might find me if I let my guard down. That's when I heard the whistling. It was so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it, a melody that wove between the natural sounds of the hollow, almost indistinguishable from the wind in the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. A simple tune, somehow familiar, though I couldn't place it. Then I remembered. It was the lullaby Rachel used to hum when she couldn't sleep, a song her grandmother had taught her. The same melody now drifted through the darkness, coming from somewhere upstream, from the direction I'd fled. "I know you're out there, Marcus," Laurel's voice called, still distant but clear enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. "I can smell your fear, your grief. They're like beacons in the night." I needed to move. Now. I kicked dirt over my fire, extinguishing it as quickly and quietly as possible, then grabbed the bandana with Rachel's ashes and started downstream once more, picking my way carefully through the darkness. The whistling followed, never seeming to get closer but never fading either. It was as if Laurel was pacing me, a predator toying with its prey. "You can't leave the hollow without my permission." "Marcus," her voice echoed through the trees. "Those who enter must pay the toll." I kept moving, one hand trailing along the creek bank to guide me in the near-total darkness. My foot caught on an exposed root, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell face first onto the rocky ground. I've had so many visitors over the years. Laurel continued, her voice somehow clearer despite the distance between us. Some I let go once they'd paid. Others, she laughed, that high, thin sound that was nothing like human mirth. Others keep me company still. As if on cue, I heard another sound joining the whistling, a low moaning that raised goosebumps on my arms. It seemed to come from the forest to my right, away from the creek. Against my better judgment, I paused, peering into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then movement caught my eye, a pale shape drifting between the trees. As it came closer, I could make out what appeared to be a human figure, but wrong somehow, distorted. It was a man, or had been once. His skin had the same grayish cast as Laurel's, but stretched tight over his bones as if he'd been mummified. His eyes were sunken, dark pits in his skull-like face. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, like a puppet on strings. "That's William," Laurel's voice came again, closer now. "He wandered into my hollow in 1937. A surveyor for the CCC. He's been keeping me company ever since." The withered figure lurched closer, reaching out with desiccated hands. I backed away, bumping into a tree trunk. "He gets so lonely," Laurel continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "It will be good for him to have a new friend." Another pale shape emerged from the forest to my left, this one the form of a woman, her body twisted and elongated as if her bones had been broken and reset at odd angles. She made no sound as she moved, her mouth a stitched line across her face. "And that's Eleanor," Laurel said. "A botanist studying rare orchids. 1982, I believe. She never says much, but she's a good listener." I was surrounded now. Laurel somewhere ahead, her undead servants closing in from either side, and unknown terrors likely waiting in the darkness behind me. The creek gurgled beside me, deep and swift. Without consciously deciding to do so, I stepped into the water. The cold shock of it nearly took my breath away, but I waded deeper until the current tugged at my waist. "Oh, Marcus," Laurel sighed, finally stepping into view on the bank I'd just left. In the darkness, her eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. "The creek won't save you. These are my waters." As if in response to her words, something brushed against my leg beneath the surface, something sinuous and cold. I jerked away, nearly losing my footing on the slick creek bed. "Last chance," Laurel said, extending her hand toward me. "Come willingly, and your existence with me will be tolerable. Resist, and I promise you centuries of suffering." The thing in the water wrapped around my ankle, tugging gently but insistently. In that moment, despair threatened to overwhelm me. There seemed no way out, no escape from this hollow and its mistress. Then my fingers tightened around the bandana in my hand, feeling the weight of Rachel's ashes within. I'd made her a promise. Death hadn't stopped me from keeping it, neither would this creature. "Go to hell," I told Laurel and plunged fully into the creek, diving beneath the surface. The current caught me immediately, sweeping me downstream. Whatever had been wrapping around my ankle let go with what felt like a frustrated snap. I fought to keep my head above water, gasping for air whenever I could. Behind me, Laurel's scream of rage echoed through the hollow, rising to a pitch that no human throat could produce. The sound pursued me as the creek carried me away, tumbling over rocks and through rapids. I lost track of time, focused only on survival, on not drowning in the rushing water. My body slammed against rocks. Branches scraped my face and arms, but I kept the bandana with Rachel's ashes clutched tight in one fist. The creek widened, deepened. The current slowed enough that I could swim rather than just being carried along. My feet touched bottom occasionally, allowing brief moments of control. Ahead, lights glimmered through the trees. Artificial lights. Civilization. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of strength. I swam harder, fighting toward those distant beacons. The creek made one final bend, and suddenly I was floating past backyards, houses set back from the water's edge. Dogs barked at my passing. A motion sensor light flicked on as I drifted near someone's dock. With the last of my strength, I pulled myself onto that dock, collapsing onto the rough wooden planks. I lay there, shivering uncontrollably, too exhausted to move or even call for help. That's where the homeowner found me at dawn, a battered, half-drowned stranger clutching a sodden bandana as if it were the most precious thing in the world. They called an ambulance, and I spent 3 days in the hospital being treated for hypothermia, a concussion, and various cuts and bruises. I told the doctors and the police that I'd gotten lost while hiking, fallen into the creek, and been swept downstream. They believed me, or pretended to. What else could they do? The truth would have sounded like the ravings of a man with a head injury. When I was released, I rented a car and drove back to the Red River Gorge. Not to hike, never to hike there again, but to finish what I'd started. I found a viewing platform near Sky Bridge, a popular tourist spot with a view almost as magnificent as Angel's Window. There, with people chatting and taking photos nearby, I finally scattered Rachel's ashes. They drifted away on the breeze, catching the light like diamond dust before disappearing into the vastness of the gorge. I whispered my goodbyes, told her I loved her, and promised to live the life she would have wanted for me. As I turned to leave, a park ranger approached me. He was an older man, his face weathered from years outdoors. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, his eyes knowing. "I was just leaving," I replied, confused by his hostility. "No," he shook his head. "I mean, you shouldn't be alive. Those who enter Laurel's Hollow don't come out. Not whole. Anyway." My blood ran cold. "You know about her?" He nodded, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "My grandfather was Cherokee. The old stories got passed down. Most rangers dismiss them as superstition, but I've seen enough over the years to know better." He studied my face. "How did you escape her?" I thought about the creek, about diving into the darkness with no guarantee of survival, about Rachel's ashes clutched in my hand. "I had a promise to keep," I said simply. The ranger seemed to accept this. "Well, whatever gods or spirits watched over you, thank them, and never go back to Swift Camp Creek. She doesn't forget, and she doesn't forgive." I've taken his advice. I moved away from Kentucky the following month, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the Red River Gorge. But sometimes, on cold October nights when the wind carries the scent of fallen leaves, I wake to the sound of whistling, a lullaby that Rachel used to hum, now twisted into something sinister. And I wonder if Laurel is still searching for me, still hungry for the grief I carried into her hollow. I wonder if someday she'll find me. Because the ranger was right about one thing. She doesn't forget, and neither do I. My name is Nathan Weiss, and I am 34 years old. This happened in June 2023. The Daniel Boone National Forest wasn't supposed to be haunted. At least, that's what I believed before everything fell apart on the Blood Echo Trail. "This is it, buddy, our big adventure," I said, kneeling to scratch behind my German Shepherd's ears. Ranger wagged his tail enthusiastically, completely unaware of what awaited us in the Kentucky wilderness. I'd adopted him 3 years ago after my divorce from Elaine, and he'd been my constant companion ever since. The therapist called him my emotional support animal, but I preferred to think of him as the only friend who hadn't taken sides after the separation. I'd spent months planning this 10-day backpacking trip through the most remote sections of Daniel Boone National Forest. The Red River Gorge area was known for its spectacular rock formations, hidden waterfalls, and dense woodland that stretched for miles without interruption. Perfect for someone like me who needed to escape the suffocating confines of corporate life and a failed marriage that still haunted me. The trail map showed our route taking us deep into the forest's heart, far from the tourist-heavy areas, along paths that the park ranger had warned were minimally maintained. Just what I wanted: a challenge, solitude, and enough physical exhaustion to quiet the thoughts that kept me awake at night. We started at the Glady Visitor Center, my backpack loaded with supplies and Ranger carrying his own small pack. The early summer air felt good, crisp and fragrant with pine. The first few miles were uneventful, and I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders loosening for the first time in months. As evening approached, we made camp near Chimney Top Rock. I set up my tent, fed Ranger, and started a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing as I heated my freeze-dried meal. It was peaceful, too peaceful perhaps. No distant car sounds, no airplane rumbles overhead. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and Ranger's contented sighs as he lay beside me. "You know, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears, "I think we're going to be okay out here." That's when I first noticed the peculiar smell, like wet soil mixed with something metallic. I dismissed it as some local plant I wasn't familiar with. Ranger lifted his head, nose twitching but didn't seem alarmed. I climbed into my sleeping bag around 10, exhausted from the day's hike but feeling more centered than I had in months. Ranger curled up at my feet, and I drifted off to the sound of gentle wind through the trees. The screaming woke me sometime after midnight. It started distantly, a high, keening wail that could have been an animal or the wind through the rock formations. But it grew closer, more distinctly human, until it seemed to circle our campsite. Ranger was on his feet instantly, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I fumbled for my flashlight and hunting knife, the only weapons I had. The screaming stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and expectant. Ranger continued to growl, facing the darkness beyond our dying fire. "Hello?" I called out, voice steadier than I felt. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Nothing. Not even the natural sounds of the forest returned. It was as if everything was holding its breath. I stepped outside the tent, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The trees seemed closer than before, pressing in on our small clearing. My light caught something, a flash of pale movement between distant trunks. "Hey!" I shouted. "If you're trying to scare us, it's not funny." Ranger barked sharply, then whimpered and pressed against my leg. That was unusual. He was trained as a protection dog and rarely showed fear. I scanned the tree line once more, then retreated to the tent, zipping it closed. Sleep evaded me for hours as I lay listening, the knife clutched in my hand. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see. Morning brought no trace of the night's disturbance. No footprints around our camp, no sign anyone had been there. I might have dismissed it as a nightmare if not for Ranger's continued unease. He stayed close as I packed up camp, his usual enthusiasm for exploration notably absent. We pressed deeper into the forest that day, following the Blood Echo Trail, named, according to the map notes, for the reddish clay that stained the path during rainstorms. The trail grew increasingly challenging, with steep switchbacks and overgrown sections that required careful navigation. By midday, we reached Swift Camp Creek, one of the landmarks I'd been looking forward to. The water ran clear and cold over moss-covered rocks. I refilled our water bottles using my filter while Ranger drank directly from the stream. The sunlight filtering through the canopy created dappled patterns on the forest floor, and for a moment, the peace I'd sought seemed within reach. That's when I noticed the carvings on a nearby tree. At first glance, they looked like typical trail markers, but upon closer inspection they formed strange symbols, curves and lines and configurations I'd never seen before. They seemed recently made, the exposed wood still light-colored and fresh. "Probably just some kids," I muttered, though we were miles from the nearest frequently used trail. Ranger whined, tugging at his leash as if eager to leave the area. We continued hiking until late afternoon when heavy clouds rolled in, threatening rain. I picked up our pace, hoping to reach the natural rock shelter marked on my map before the downpour started. The first drops were falling as we arrived at what should have been Hollow Rock Shelter, except it wasn't there. The map clearly showed a large cave-like overhang where hikers often camped, But we found only a small indentation in the cliff face, barely enough to keep gear dry, let alone provide shelter for the night. "This can't be right," I said, checking my GPS. The coordinates matched, but the shelter was a fraction of what was described. It was as if the rock had somehow receded, the shelter diminishing over time. With no better options, I hurriedly set up our camp as the rain intensified. The small overhang was just enough to cover my tent if I squeezed it against the cliff wall. I worked quickly, getting soaked in the process. Once inside, I changed into dry clothes and tried to warm up. Ranger seemed unusually agitated, pacing the small space, occasionally freezing to stare at the tent wall facing the forest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, rubbing his fur. He whined softly, pressing closer to me. The rain fell in sheets now, drumming against the tent. Without a fire, I ate a cold dinner of beef jerky and trail mix. As daylight faded, the darkness seemed to press in, absolute beyond the weak glow of my lantern. That night, I dreamed of the forest floor breathing, rising and falling like a giant chest. In the dream, the tree roots writhed like snakes, reaching for my sleeping form. I woke, gasping, sweat-soaked despite the cool air. A quick check of my watch showed it was 3:17 a.m., what paranormal investigators call the dead time. I'd never put stock in such superstitions, but in that moment, with rain hissing against the tent and Ranger trembling beside me, it was difficult not to feel a chill of irrational fear. I reached for my phone to check the weather forecast, but the screen remained black despite being fully charged when we'd made camp. Dead. I tried my backup power bank, also dead, despite minimal use. Even my GPS device displayed only garbled characters before going dark. Electronics failure. Great, I muttered, trying to convince myself it was just the moisture or some electrical storm interference. But I didn't believe it. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the rain gradually subside and the forest slowly come alive with morning sounds. Only when pale light filtered through the tent fabric did I finally relax enough to doze off again. When I next opened my eyes, it was past 9, much later than I'd planned to start hiking. The air was thick with humidity after the rain, promising a muggy, difficult day. My joints ached as I crawled from the tent. The sight that greeted me stopped me cold. Our campsite was surrounded by small cairns. Stacks of stones balanced one atop another, dozens of them forming a perfect circle around my tent. They hadn't been there the night before. I would have tripped over them setting up camp in the rain. "What the hell?" I whispered. Ranger growled, his focus fixed on the forest beyond the stone sentinels. I followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual among the dripping trees. Someone had been here while we slept, someone who could move silently enough not to wake either of us. The thought made my skin crawl. I packed quickly, no longer caring about the planned route. We needed to get back to civilization, back to where strange stone arrangements and nighttime screamers couldn't reach us. I consulted my paper map, relieved to find it still legible despite the humidity. The quickest way out was to continue along Blood Echo Trail for another 4 miles, then take the Rock Bridge Connector Trail back toward the main road. With luck, we could make it by nightfall. We set off at a brisk pace, Ranger now alert and watchful. The forest felt different, the usual sense of peaceful solitude replaced by a nagging feeling of being observed. Several times I caught myself looking over my shoulder, certain I'd glimpsed movement in my peripheral vision. Around noon, we came upon an old hunting cabin not marked on my map. It stood in a small clearing, its timber walls weathered gray with age. The door hung partially open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Under normal circumstances, I might have investigated, looking for emergency supplies or trail register. But something about the cabin raised every alarm in my body. Perhaps it was the absence of footprints in the muddy ground around it, or the unnatural stillness of the air in the clearing. "Not today," I murmured, giving it a wide berth. Ranger needed no encouragement to avoid it, pulling hard on his leash to stay as far from the structure as possible. As we passed, I could have sworn I heard humming coming from inside. a tuneless, monotonous sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I quickened our pace until the cabin was lost from view behind us. The trail began to ascend steeply, winding up through increasingly rocky terrain. My calves burned with the effort, and my soaked boots had begun to rub blisters on my heels. But physical discomfort was preferable to the alternative, spending another night in these woods. We crested a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. In the distance, I could make out what looked like roads and possibly buildings. Civilization, still far off, but visible. The sight gave me renewed energy. That's when I noticed the smoke. A thin column rose from the forest perhaps a mile behind us, exactly where the cabin had been. Someone was there after all. But why light a fire in the middle of a humid day? I was debating whether this was a good or bad sign when Ranger suddenly froze, ears forward, every muscle tense. A moment later, I heard it too, the crunch of footsteps on the trail behind us, steady and unhurried. We'd encountered no other hikers since starting our journey. The visitor center had mentioned low trail usage due to recent flash flood warnings, yet someone was following us. "Hello," I called out, turning to face the sound. "Another hiker?" The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched for several long seconds. Then came a voice, scratchy, as if rarely used, neither distinctly male nor female. Nathan. My name. My blood ran cold. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone in the forest, hadn't signed any trail registers. No one should know who I was. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. Ranger's growl deepened, his body coiled to spring. I tightened my grip on his leash. "You shouldn't be here, Nathan," the voice continued, closer now though I could see no one. "This isn't your path." From around a bend in the trail emerged a figure that at first glance appeared to be an elderly woman. She wore what looked like homespun clothing, a long, shapeless dress of faded gray with a shawl wrapped around bony shoulders. Her hair hung in limp white strands around a face that was deeply lined. But as she drew nearer, details began to blur and shift. Her height seemed inconsistent, sometimes appearing barely 5 feet tall, other times looming larger. And her face. Something was wrong with her face. The features seemed to slide slightly, as if her skin was a mask that didn't quite fit. "Who are you?" I asked, backing away slowly. Ranger's growls had given way to high-pitched whimpers. "Folks round here call me Aunt Sadie," she said, her mouth stretching into what might have been intended as a smile. Too wide, too many teeth. Been living in these parts since before they called it Daniel Boone's Forest, before they called it anything at all. That was impossible. The forest had been established in the 1930s and named long before that. This woman couldn't be more than 80, despite her weathered appearance. "I'm just passing through," I said carefully, heading back to the main road. "Are you now?" Aunt Sadie tilted her head at an angle that made my stomach lurch. The forest doesn't usually let go of what it claims, especially not at Hollow Blood Moon. I had no idea what a Hollow Blood Moon was, but I wasn't about to ask. Every instinct screamed at me to get away from this woman. "Well, nice meeting you," I said, continuing to back away. "But we really need to get going before dark." "Dark comes early these days," she replied cryptically. "And it's hungry, Nathan Weiss. Hungry for those who carry grief like yours." My divorce. How could she possibly know about that? Fear crystallized into something sharper, a surge of adrenaline and anger. "Stay away from us," I said firmly, drawing my hunting knife from its sheath. "We're leaving now." Aunt Sadie made no move to follow as we retreated up the trail, but her voice carried after us, sing-song and terrible. "Run, all you like, city boy. The echo finds everyone in the end." I didn't look back until we'd put at least a quarter mile between us and the strange woman. When I finally did, the trail behind us was empty. We pushed on as fast as safety allowed, the encounter adding desperate energy to our pace. I checked my watch compulsively, watching the hours tick away. We needed to reach the main trail before sunset. The terrain grew more difficult. Washouts from the recent rain had carved gullies across the path, and fallen trees created obstacles we had to clamber over or detour around. It was as if the forest itself was trying to slow our progress. By late afternoon, I realized we wouldn't make it out before dark. The knowledge settled like a stone in my stomach. We'd have to spend one more night in the forest. I searched for a defensible campsite, someplace with clear sightlines and few approaches. Eventually, I settled on a small plateau overlooking the trail we'd been following. At least, nothing could sneak up on us from behind. As I set up the tent with trembling hands, Ranger kept watch, his body tense and alert. I gathered stones to form a large fire ring, determined to keep flames burning all night. Whatever was in these woods, Aunt Sadie, or something worse, seemed averse to light. With camp established, I used our filtered water to prepare a hot meal, hoping the calories would fortify us for whatever the night might bring. As I ate, I tried to rationalize the events of the past 2 days. Perhaps Aunt Sadie was just an eccentric local, possibly mentally ill, who wandered the forest and happened to overhear my name when I was talking to Ranger. The stone cairns could have been left by previous campers. The screams might have been a fox or bobcat, their cries notoriously human-like. But I couldn't explain how she knew about my grief, my divorce, or why my electronics had all failed simultaneously, or the sense of malevolent awareness that seemed to permeate the forest around us. As darkness fell, I built the fire higher, creating a circle of light around our tent. I placed my knife, flashlight, and walking stick within easy reach of my sleeping bag. Ranger lay at the tent entrance, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the gathering shadows. Sleep was out of the question. I sat cross-legged in the tent doorway, feeding sticks to the fire whenever it threatened to dim. The night sounds of the forest were unnaturally muted, as if something was dampening the usual chorus of insects and nocturnal creatures. Around midnight, Ranger suddenly stood, ears forward, a rumble building in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, straining to hear what had alerted him. At first, there was nothing. Then I caught it. The soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps circling our camp just beyond the firelight's reach. My hand closed around the knife handle. "Who's there?" I called, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "I'm armed." The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice, the high, keening wail we'd heard the first night, but closer now. Much closer. It modulated into something that might have been laughter or crying or both. "Show yourself," I shouted, fear making my voice crack. The fire suddenly flared brighter, casting our shadows long against the tent fabric. In that moment of increased illumination, I saw them, figures standing at the edge of the light. Not just Aunt Sadie, but at least half a dozen others, their forms indistinct and shifting, as if viewed through water. They made no move to approach but stood watching with eyes that caught and reflected the firelight like animals. Ranger's barking became frantic. I held him back, afraid of what might happen if he charged into the darkness. "What do you want?" I called out. Aunt Sadie's voice answered, though I couldn't tell which figure was hers. "We want what the forest wants, Nathan Weiss. Balance, payment, the echo of blood for blood." "I don't understand," I said, the knife trembling in my hand. "The land remembers," came the reply, "even when men forget. This ground drank deep of suffering once. It thirsts still." As if on cue, the fire dimmed, despite the ample fuel. The figures seemed to draw closer without moving, the darkness contracting around our small haven of light. "Your grief called to us," Aunt Sadie continued, "so sharp and sweet. The forest loves broken souls. They're easier to reshape." The implications of her words sent a spike of terror through me. I backed into the tent, pulling Ranger with me, and fumbled to zip the entrance closed, as if thin nylon could provide any protection. Through the tent fabric, I could see the shadows of the watchers growing more distinct as the fire faded. Their movements became more erratic, jerking and swaying in ways that defied normal human motion. The temperature inside the tent plummeted, my breath fogging in front of my face. Something scratched along the outside of the tent. Not the sound of branches or animals, but deliberate, like fingers tracing patterns. I huddled with Ranger in the center of the tent, knife clutched in one hand, his fur gripped in the other. Outside, voices began to meld together in a chanting murmur too quiet to make out individual words. The scratching intensified, circling the tent. Then came a new sound, the soft pad of something wet hitting the tent fabric. One drop, then another. A dark stain spread where each drop landed, expanding slowly. The smell hit me a moment later, the metallic tang of blood. It was raining blood. I stifled a scream as the drops became a steady patter, the tent soon covered in dark splotches. The chanting outside grew louder, forming words I could now understand. Blood, echo calls. Blood, echo binds. Blood, echo claims. Blood, echo finds. Ranger whimpered, pressing his body against mine. I wrapped my arms around him, whispering senseless reassurances. The knife felt useless now against whatever waited outside. The tent fabric began to bulge inward, as if invisible hands were pressing against it from all sides. The pressure increased until the tent poles groaned, threatening to snap. In desperation, I reached for my backpack and fumbled inside for anything that might help. My hand closed around a small metal object, the lighter I used to start fires. A stupid, inadequate defense, but it was all I had. As the tent buckled further, I flicked the lighter to life, the small flame casting wild shadows inside our collapsing shelter. To my shock, the pressure immediately eased, the tent walls snapping back into place. The chanting faltered. Understanding dawned. They feared fire. Real fire, not the strange, diminishing flames of my campfire. I grabbed my can of stove fuel and unscrewed the top, ready to create a makeshift flamethrower if the tent walls gave way. But the moment passed. The pressure withdrew entirely. The blood rain stopped, leaving the tent covered in rapidly drying stains. Outside, the voices faded, though whether they'd left or merely fallen silent, I couldn't tell. I kept the lighter burning until the metal grew too hot to hold, then lit my backup camp lantern. Ranger remained tense beside me, growling softly at sounds I couldn't detect. Neither of us slept. We sat in the blood-stained tent as hours crawled by, jumping at every crack of branches or whisper of wind. When the first gray light of dawn finally appeared, it felt like we'd survived a century of darkness. I packed with frantic speed, not bothering with breakfast or coffee. The tent was ruined, covered in rusty stains that flaked away like dried paint, but I stuffed it into my pack anyway. I'd need proof of what had happened, even if only to convince myself later. The plateau where we'd camped showed no signs of the night's visitation. No footprints circled our site. The fire had burnt to cold ash, consumed far more quickly than it should have been, and there was no trace of blood on the ground around our tent. We abandoned the established trail, using my compass to navigate directly toward where I believed the main road lay. Every shadow between the trees seemed to conceal watching eyes. Every birdsong sounded like a distant echo of that terrible chanting. Around mid-morning, we came upon a stream not marked on my map. The water ran red-brown, which might have been attributed to clay sediment if not for the events of the previous night. Ranger refused to approach it, regardless of his thirst. We pushed on, rationing our remaining water. The forest grew denser, the underbrush grabbing at our legs as if trying to hold us back. Several times I found myself facing impenetrable thickets where the compass insisted we should go, forcing lengthy detours. By early afternoon, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me. We paused in a small clearing where sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. I sank to the ground, muscles trembling from the sustained effort and lack of sleep. Ranger remained standing, hackles raised, staring into the trees. Following his gaze, I spotted a small cairn of stones, just like those that had surrounded our camp. As I watched, a pebble fell from somewhere above, landing perfectly atop the stack. I scrambled to my feet. We need to move, now. But which way? The compass needle spun uselessly, settling on a new direction each time I checked it. The sun was obscured by clouds, removing that navigational aid. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I forced several deep breaths, trying to think clearly. We'd been traveling downhill most of the morning. Roads and settlements typically followed valleys, not ridges. If we continued descending, we might find our way out. We pressed on, following the path of least resistance through the undergrowth. Hours passed. My water ran out. Ranger panted heavily beside me, tongue lolling. I began to fear we were walking in circles, trapped in some impossible loop of forest. Then, through the trees ahead, I glimpsed something that stopped me in my tracks, the hunting cabin from the previous day. Somehow, we'd returned to it, despite walking in what I'd believed was the opposite direction. This time, the door stood wide open. Smoke rose from the chimney, though no fire could burn hot enough to produce smoke so black and thick. The humming I'd heard before was louder now, reverberating through the clearing. "Not this way," I murmured, turning to retreat. "Nathan." The voice came from behind me, Aunt Sadie's scratchy tones. I spun to find her blocking our path, more substantial in daylight but no less wrong. Her eyes were the color of the bloodied tent fabric, and her fingernails were black, as if charred by fire. "You've led us in circles," I accused, clutching Ranger's leash with white-knuckled fingers. "The forest doesn't circle," she replied, that too wide smile spreading across her face. "It spirals. Always inward, always to the heart." "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked with fear and dehydration. "Not what I want," Aunt Sadie said, taking a step closer. "What it wants. What's owed." She pointed one blackened finger at my chest. "The grief you carry, the pain you won't release, rich soil for what grows in the shadows here." "I don't understand," I repeated, though a terrible suspicion was forming. 3 years since your wife left," Aunt Sadie said, confirming she somehow knew details of my life. 3 years of anger, of blame, of wishing harm. I flinched. In the darkest moments after Elaine left me for my former best friend, I had indeed harbored thoughts I wasn't proud of. Fantasies of revenge, of their suffering. Thoughts I'd never acted on but had nursed in secret corners of my mind. "That darkness calls to darkness," Aunt Sadie continued. "The Blood Echo Trail was named for more than clay, city boy. Some paths are formed by repeated suffering. Some woods feed on darker things than sunlight." Behind her, figures began to emerge from between the trees. The watchers from the night before, now visible in the fading afternoon light. They moved with that same unnatural gait, as if their joints bent in ways human bones shouldn't allow. "We offer a trade," Aunt Sadie said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Give us the dog, and you may leave these woods. The forest will accept this substitute. For now." Horror washed through me. "No, never." Ranger growled beside me, sensing my fear but standing his ground. He had been my only comfort after Elaine left. The only living being who hadn't judged me or taken sides. I would die before abandoning him. "Then you'll both join us," Aunt Sadie said simply. Another voice in the echo. Another shadow among shadows. The watchers began to close in, forming a shrinking circle around us. Their features became clearer as they approached, faces that might once have been human but had been stretched and distorted, as if viewed through a broken mirror. Some wore the tattered remains of hiking clothes. Others were dressed in outdated styles spanning decades. Previous victims, I realized. Those who hadn't escaped the forest. In that moment of clarity, something shifted within me. The fear didn't disappear, but it crystallized into a cold, focused resolve. I had spent 3 years drowning in grief and resentment, letting it consume me from within. I had come to these woods seeking escape but had brought my darkness with me. A beacon for whatever ancient hunger dwelled here. "No," I said again, but quieter now with certainty rather than panic. "You've fed on my grief long enough. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the lighter. The gathering shadows seemed to recoil slightly from even this potential of flame. "Nathan," Aunt Sadie hissed, her form beginning to blur at the edges, as if she was struggling to maintain substance. "You cannot leave. The forest has chosen." "I choose," I countered, flicking the lighter to life. The small flame danced between us. "I choose to let go." And as I said the words, I felt something inside me release. The knot of bitterness I'd carried since the divorce, the dark wishes I'd harbored against Elaine and James. Not forgotten, but no longer feeding the rot at my core. The watchers hesitated, their movements becoming uncertain. Aunt Sadie's face contorted with rage, or perhaps hunger. "Run," I told the ranger, releasing his leash. For once, he obeyed without hesitation, darting through a gap in the circle of watchers. I followed immediately after, the lighter held before me like a talisman. Hands grabbed at my clothes, cold and strong as iron bands. Voices wailed in frustration as the small flame kept them from maintaining their grip. I ran blindly, following the sound of Ranger's movement through the underbrush ahead. Behind us, the wailing transformed into that terrible chanting once more. Blood echo calls. Blood echo binds. Blood echo claims. Blood echo finds. I didn't look back. Every ounce of energy went into pushing forward, following Ranger's lead as he navigated through the forest with more certainty than any compass. The light was fading fast now, shadows lengthening into the dangerous dark that had nearly claimed us the night before. But ahead, through a break in the trees, I glimpsed something that sent a surge of hope through my exhausted body, the straight line of a road cutting through the wilderness. "Almost there, buddy," I gasped, my lungs burning with effort. The chanting grew louder, closer, the shadows around us seeming to thicken and reach with grasping tendrils. The lighter's flame flickered dangerously low as the fuel neared exhaustion. In that moment, with safety in sight but not yet reached, I made a choice. I stopped, turned, and faced what pursued us. The watchers boiled from the tree line like a nightmare made manifest, Aunt Sadie at their center, her form larger now, elongated to impossible proportions. I raised the dying lighter one last time and spoke directly to the darkness gathering before me. "I release you," I said, not to them but to the poisonous grief I'd carried for so long. I let go. I threw the lighter into the dry underbrush at the forest's edge. Perhaps it was chance, or perhaps something more, but the flame caught immediately, spreading with unnatural speed along the boundary between forest and road. The fire formed a barrier between us and the watchers. They reared back, their forms dissolving into smoke and shadow where the flames reached highest. Aunt Sadie's voice cut through the roar of the spreading fire. "This isn't finished, Nathan Weiss. The blood echo never ends. It only waits." But her threats held less power now. I turned my back on the fire, on the forest and its hungry shadows, and joined Ranger on the road. Together, we walked toward distant lights that promised safety, civilization, and a world where darkness couldn't take physical form. It wasn't until we reached the ranger station 2 miles down the road that I realized the significance of what had nearly happened. The forest hadn't just been trying to kill me, it had been trying to transform me, to add my voice to its chorus of eternal suffering, to make me one of the watchers, forever trapped in that spiral of hatred and pain. I reported what I could to the park rangers, a condensed version about getting lost and nearly caught in a forest fire. They seemed skeptical but concerned enough to send a team to check the area. The fire, apparently, had died out on its own, contained to a small patch of underbrush with no evidence it had ever threatened to spread further. When I described the location of the hunting cabin, they exchanged confused glances. According to their records, no such structure existed in that section of the forest. The Blood Echo Trail itself, they informed me, had been officially renamed Whispering Pine Path decades ago, though some locals still used the old name. I returned to my life in Cincinnati with Ranger, but I was not the same man who had entered Daniel Boone National Forest. The experience had forced me to confront and finally release the toxic bitterness I'd been nurturing since my divorce. In freeing myself from that self-imposed burden, I had somehow also freed myself from whatever ancient hunger had marked me as prey. Sometimes, though, when the night is particularly dark and silent, I imagine I hear a distant chanting, a reminder that some paths, once walked, can never truly be left behind. And I wonder if somewhere in those Kentucky woods, Aunt Sadie and her watchers are still waiting, still hungry, still calling to those whose grief might lead them astray. The blood echo never ends. It only waits,